A thick layer of dust stretched across Highway 83, swirling up in tiny dancing devils whenever a passing truck disturbed the air. Only miles away stood the imposing hulk of the Rio Grande Detention Facility, a modern structure of concrete, fences, and watchtowers. The sun was barely making its ascent on the horizon, turning the Texan sky into a swirl of orange and red. It was spring, but the air felt more like the lead-up to a great summer storm, restless and vaguely foreboding. Robert Chandler sipped black coffee from a well-worn thermos, perched on the catwalk that overlooked the first security gate. He was alone there, as he often was in the early morning. His posture was deceptively casual. He leaned on the metal railing, wearing a short-sleeved security uniform that did little to hide the impressive musculature beneath. Streaks of silver crept through his cropped dark hair, and faint lines around his eyes spoke to the battles he had seen. In truth, Robert Chandler had fought in corners of the world even the best cartographers could not pronounce. 27 years in Delta Force had left him with joints that ached in cold weather, scars from a half-dozen bullet wounds, and secrets he kept buried under layers of forced calm. His men, the 5 who had served with him in some of the deadliest theaters on Earth, were scattered throughout the facility that morning, each assigned a benign-sounding role: shift supervisor, perimeter patrolman, logistics coordinator, transport driver, intelligence liaison. An entire chain of command disguised beneath standard-issue uniforms. "Morning, boss," came a soft voice from behind him. He turned to see John "Red" Jacobs, one of his old teammates, stepping onto the catwalk. Red had the confident stride of a man who survived more IEDs in Afghanistan than he cared to count. He was tall, lanky, and sported hair that had once been flaming red but was now beginning to dull with age. The faint laughter lines around his eyes gave him a disarming warmth that belied the lethal precision beneath. "How's it looking?" Robert asked, offering Red the thermos. Red took a sip, nodding in appreciation. "Quiet. A couple new detainee transfers coming in around midday. Alvarez is handling security checks. But I've got this itch at the back of my neck." Robert grimaced. That was their old code for imminent trouble. "Yeah, I've had the same itch since sunrise." They glanced at each other knowingly. Over the years, they had learned not to dismiss such feelings. Their instincts had saved them on countless black operations where the margin between life and death was measured in microseconds. At first glance, this place was calm. The desert wind, the watchtowers, the chain-link fences topped with razor wire. But there was something brewing in the air, a tension far heavier than mere dust storms. Just then, Robert's calm crackled to life. "Chandler, we've got some unusual chatter on the radio. Could be nothing, but you might want to come down and have a listen." It was Ray Breaker Hammond, stationed in the main control room. If Breaker described anything as unusual, Robert paid attention. In the field, Breaker had been their comms and surveillance expert. The man could decode enemy transmissions in half the time of an entire intelligence team. Now, his day job was to monitor the facility's cameras and coordinate perimeter checks. But the old habits, and the old keen ear for suspicious frequencies, were still intact. "On my way," Robert said, handing the thermos back to Red. He made his way down the winding metal steps, boots ringing out against steel. The sun was higher now, bathing the concrete walls in harsh yellow light. Inside, the detention facility was colder, air-conditioned, and smelled faintly of antiseptic. Rows of security monitors lined the control room walls. Breaker was already analyzing waveforms on a second screen, his brow furrowed in concentration. He wore a standard ICE officer's uniform, but his bearing was all Delta Force, methodical, intense, focused. "Hey, boss," Breaker said without looking up. "I picked up some chatter on a shortwave frequency that usually belongs to civilian truckers. The problem is the accent, a real thick northern Mexican accent." They're calling out coordinates that match a spot near the facility. Could be nothing. Could be some ranchers or just travelers who ended up on the wrong channel. But I don't think so. Breaker clicked on the recording, letting Robert listen. The Spanish was rapid, hushed, laced with half-coded references to delivery and product. Robert frowned. They're talking about timing. Something about hitting the chain at sunrise. Or soon. Breaker nodded. Right? They mentioned a key to the door, but the context is murky. Feels like recon talk to me. As Robert listened, the hair on the back of his neck stood up once again. This was no random confusion on the trucker's band. This was operational chatter. He had encountered such coded language in every conflict zone from Kabul to Mosul. How do you want to play it? Breaker asked, knowing full well how Robert preferred to operate. Quiet. Lethal. Surgical. It was the hallmark of Delta Force. Robert stared at the screen, his mind already mapping out the angles. Let's get the rest of the team on alert, but keep it subtle. I don't want to scare the rank-and-file staff unless we're sure. Everyone goes on heightened watch, though. Check the perimeter sensors again. Sweep every external camera. If there's a threat, I want to see them coming. Breaker smirked. You got it, boss. Robert moved back into the hallway and tapped his comm to reach the rest of his clandestine team. Red Jacobs, Darius Mojo Morgan, Sam Tien, Levi Eagle Eye Thorson, and Diego Alvarez. Collectively, the men that had once been under his command in the deadliest corners of the globe. Each had his own story of valor and horror, but as a unit they were nearly unstoppable. One by one, the men acknowledged. Calm, professional, not a hint of the tension or excitement that might have betrayed them as something more than ordinary security personnel. They'd spent months preparing the facility's defenses in case something like this ever happened. Officially, they were just an experienced security detail hired as an extra layer of defense. In reality, they were the embodiment of lethal skill. Robert left the control room, heading toward the staff quarters, a sense of dread twisting in his stomach. Whispers of the Santa Rosa Cartel had crossed his desk in the past. They were known for violence, cunning, and insidious infiltration. The facility's intelligence had never indicated they would target ICE detention centers. They preferred drug routes and territory battles south of the border. But new intel suggested the Santa Rosa Cartel had been expanding their reach, and presumably their ambitions. He considered the possibility that the cartel planned to break out a high-value detainee or perhaps eliminate a troublesome witness. Whatever their purpose, if they attempted a breach, they'd be stepping right into the lion's den. Because behind these walls was not just standard ICE security. It was 6 men who had tasted more violence than the entire cartel combined. Still, knowledge didn't quell the creeping unease. Cartels had virtually limitless manpower. They also had resources and the capacity for brutal, unspeakable methods. If they were desperate enough or believed the risk was worth the payoff, they wouldn't hold back. The question was, who had they come for? The day stretched on and the tension only grew. By midday, Robert checked in with each of his team members. Diego Alvarez, the only one of them born and raised in Mexico, was quietly gathering his own intel. He had contacts in border towns who could confirm if cartel movement was on the rise. Diego's background had made him a natural infiltration expert during their special operations days. He moved between worlds with ease. Red Jacobs manned the perimeter, occasionally tapping his baton on the chain-link fence, outwardly bored. In reality, he scanned the horizon with an eagle's awareness, searching for any sign of a threat. Sam Tien, the quietest of the bunch, handled interior surveillance alongside Breaker, while Levi Eagle Eye Thorson coordinated with transport convoys and vehicles entering or leaving the facility. By late afternoon, the sun blazed overhead in scorching heat. The newly arrived detainees, some exhausted from the journey, others anxious, were processed, their details noted, and assigned to holding cells. Civilians who worked at the facility, clerks, administrative staff, and part-time medical workers, went about their routines, oblivious to the heightened vigilance swirling around them. Robert hovered near the Sally port, scanning the area for anything amiss. By now, the dread in his gut had become an undeniable certainty. The Santa Rosa cartel, or a fraction of it, was out there. He could sense them like a predator senses another predator lurking just beyond sight. He felt the hush, the gathering silence that often precedes a storm. Then, a coded text reached his phone, courtesy of Diego's off-the-record contact in a dusty little Mexican border town. The Spanish read simply, Van Norte, Alguien import anti-encerrado. Cuidado. They're headed north. Someone important is locked up there. Be careful. No name, no further detail. Robert's jaw clenched. So it was a hit or a breakout on behalf of a detainee in the facility. The question was, who was so important that the Santa Rosa cartel would risk crossing the border, infiltrating a federal detention center, and tangling with U.S. authorities? He needed to find out. His mind raced through the detainee roster. Drug traffickers, coyotes, petty criminals, potential terrorists. Could it be a high-ranking cartel lieutenant who'd been picked up by ICE? Or maybe an accountant who knew the cartel's financial routes? Robert marched directly to the administrative wing to check the high-security list. As he typed in credentials at a secure terminal, the hum of the computer seemed thunderous in the silent corridor. He scanned the detainee database for possible matches. Any known Santa Rosa associates or big players who arrived in the last few weeks. One name popped up in red, flagged by multiple agencies. Raul El Zurdo Martinez. Picked up 2 nights ago on the outskirts of McAllen, Texas. Age 42. Known mid-level enforcer for Santa Rosa. Rumored to have close ties to the cartel's upper echelon. Interpol believed he was climbing the chain, personally linked to kidnappings, murders, and even the disappearance of a DEA liaison. If the cartel were going to mount a breach, it would be for someone like him. A new wave of tension rippled through Robert's body. He suspected El Zurdo wasn't just some mid-level guy. His file reeked of deeper connections. Robert had seen men like this before, ruthless, unwavering in loyalty, and deadly. He stepped away from the screen, cold determination crystallizing behind his eyes. The ordinary day was over. Now they were playing for keeps, and in the coming hours or days, blood would be spilled. If the cartel wanted their man back, they would have to go through him and his men first. Robert paused, letting the thunderous hush settle in his mind. Outside, the hot wind had begun to shift, carrying the promise of a coming storm. The men on the outside had no idea what awaited them. If they came for a fight, they would meet a living, breathing nightmare. They thought they'd be crossing swords with standard IC security, a handful of untested guards. They had no clue that hidden in plain sight was the deadliest blockade they could have imagined. He tapped his comm again. Team, converge on the staff lounge in 5. We've got a target. El Zurdo. The Santa Rosa cartel is coming, and we are their welcoming committee. He clicked off and let the finality of those words hang in the air. This was it, a collision course between unstoppable force and immovable object. As Robert stepped back into the corridor, the overhead fluorescent lights buzzed, and somewhere, the clock on the wall ticked a little too loudly. Each second that passed brought the cartel closer. Would they come at dusk? Dawn? Possibly in the dead of night. Whenever it happened, Robert knew one thing. The men from Delta Force had been forged for moments like this, and they would do whatever it took to ensure that the facility and the people within it remained safe. Outside, the wind picked up speed, whipping red dust against the walls. Clouds drifted in, half hidden by the failing sunlight, painting the horizon in shades of deep purple and burnt orange. Night was coming, a cloak for those who moved in the shadows. And for Robert Chandler, the next hours would be the ultimate test of everything he had ever been trained to do. As Robert prepared to meet his team, none of them knew that a small convoy of tinted SUVs had just crossed the border, rolling inexorably toward Rio Seco, guided by men armed to the teeth and ready to kill for El Zurdo. In a quiet staff lounge tucked behind the facility's administrative wing, 6 men convened in hushed tones. The scent of stale coffee and day-old pastries hung in the air, but no one paid attention. The typical hum of after-hours chatter was conspicuously absent. The handful of late-shift employees had long since headed to the cafeteria, giving Robert Chandler and his fellow operators the privacy they needed. Robert stood at the head of a small table, arms folded over his chest. The overhead fluorescent lights lent a sterile glow to the room. He quickly scanned his men, ensuring they were fully present and ready. Darius Mojo Morgan leaned against the wall, his eyes narrowed in thought. The broad-shouldered ex-operator had a perpetual scowl, as if a part of him was always on a battlefield. Sam Tien sat in a chair, posture erect, almost meditative, like a coiled spring waiting for an excuse to snap into motion. Levi Eagle Eye Thorson towered beside him, arms crossed, scanning everyone else with a silent, protective air. Red Jacobs was pacing, unable to keep still, the tension swirling around them. Lastly, Diego Alvarez stood to one side, phone in hand, scanning messages from his contact who had first alerted them to the cartel's move. "All right," Robert began quietly. "I've got eyes on an enforcer named Raul Martinez. Goes by El Zurdo. Picked up near McAllen on Tuesday. He's Santa Rosa. We suspect they're coming for him." Mojo sighed, his deep baritone rumbling like distant thunder. "And from what I hear, the Santa Rosa cartel doesn't do things halfway. They're ruthless, boss." Sam Tien nodded. "They've been expanding. If they've got the resources, they won't hesitate to throw bodies at us. We might be looking at a small army if they want him bad enough." Diego Alvarez interjected, his voice steady and low. "My contact says at least 3 vehicles crossed the border an hour ago, possibly more behind them. They've got an infiltration plan. The chatter specifically mentions Sunrise as a target, but we can't be sure. Could be a ruse. Could be they hit earlier. Either way, we're dealing with serious players." Robert pressed his lips into a thin line. "We operate under the assumption they'll try tonight. If not tonight, then soon. They're probably scoping out external security, looking for weak links. We show them none." He turned to face the men fully. "We have one mission. Keep this facility locked down. Prevent them from extracting or killing El Zurdo. We do this as quietly and professionally as possible. We can't risk a news story about a bloodbath at an IC detention center. Too many political ripple effects. But if they push us, we push back." A solemn hush followed. The men looked at one another, exchanging subtle nods. This was their world, the place where they excelled. They had spent their entire adult lives in the shadows, carrying out missions whose success hinged on impeccable coordination and lethal decisiveness. "Positions?" Sam asked, breaking the silence. Robert drew a rough sketch of the facility on a piece of scrap paper from the lounge counter. "We'll run tight roving patrols outside the perimeter. We're short-staffed, but the standard ICE guards can handle interior patrol routes. We supplement them. Diego, you blend in as usual, but keep your phone on in case your contact updates us. Red and Eagle Eye, you two rotate around the eastern fence line. Sam, you and Breaker manage the control room. Watch the cameras and monitor all frequencies. Mojo, you'll be with me on ground-level external sweeps." Eagle Eye tapped a finger on the map. "And if they come with more than 3 vehicles?" Robert fixed him with a steely look. "Then we adapt and neutralize the threat. Remember, we're a ghost unit. We only escalate once they show hostile intent. Let them approach, let them think the facility is easy prey. Then we show them what a real fight looks like." A slow, predatory grin spread across Mojo's face. "Can't wait." They broke from the huddle, each man heading off to his assigned position. The staff lounge door clicked shut behind them, sealing the tension inside. This time, there was no more idle talk. Each operator knew what might be coming. A whirlwind of violence that could claim innocent lives if they slipped up. Robert and Mojo emerged onto the facility's outer walkway, where the air was slightly cooler under the descending night sky. The lights atop the perimeter fence cast eerie white cones on the dusty ground. Robert inhaled deeply. Despite decades of warfare, he never grew numb to the pre-battle stillness. It was that timeless hush, that calm just before the strike. They walked the fence line, greeting a pair of ICE guards, both oblivious to the true severity of the threat. Robert flashed them a tight smile and some vague advice about being extra vigilant. The guards nodded, but their eyes lacked the deep-seated readiness that came from a lifetime of conflict. These were ordinary men doing an ordinary job. If the Santa Rosa cartel stormed the gates, these guards would be woefully outmatched. That was why Robert and his team were here. Got a feeling this is bigger than just a standard bust-out, Mojo said under his breath as they continued their patrol. I mean, how valuable is El Zurdo? Robert stared ahead, scanning the darkness. Valuable enough for them to risk an international incident. Possibly they want to silence him before he talks. Maybe he's carrying intel that can topple the cartel's leadership. Doesn't matter. Our job is to ensure they don't succeed. Mojo grunted in agreement. Over the years, they had extracted warlords, rescued hostages, and destroyed terror cells. Guarding an IC detention facility might have seemed small potatoes in comparison, but the principle was the same. Protect, neutralize, survive. Eyes open, Robert said as they reached a corner tower. The guard up top gave them a wave. They returned it but didn't linger. They continued around the back of the facility, out of sight from the main highway, where the fence met a shallow creek that trickled south. The desert night was quiet except for the chirp of insects and the distant rumble of a passing semi. Half an hour later, they circled back to the main gate. A single guard booth stood, illuminated by an overhead lamp. The occupant, a 30-something guard named Jake, blinked at them in surprise. "Evening, Mr. Chandler. Everything okay?" Robert nodded. "Just a routine check. Let us know if you see any suspicious vehicles. People loitering, deliveries at odd hours. Anything unusual." Jake squinted, sensing the urgency in Robert's voice. "Sure thing. Will do." With that, Robert and Mojo slipped away. Meanwhile, on the facility's roof, Levi Eagle Eye Thorson scanned the horizon through high-powered binoculars. He moved slowly, methodically, from one quadrant to another, searching for the faintest flicker of headlights or any sign of movement beyond the highway. Behind him, Red Jacobs emerged from a rooftop doorway. "Anything?" "Not yet," Eagle Eye said. "But the night's young." They stood there, side by side, silent guardians. If something came their way, they would see it, and they would be ready. An owl hooted from somewhere in the desert brush, a haunting note that vanished into the star-strewn sky. In the facility's command center, Sam Tien and Ray Breaker Hammond pored over monitors. The facility's cameras offered a patchwork view. Perimeter fences, interior corridors, empty recreation yards, the loading bay. A single red sensor pulsed softly, capturing the feed from the motion detectors scattered along the outer fence line. Breaker tapped a headset that connected him to an encrypted channel. "Boss, I got a call from the local sheriff. He wants to confirm a midnight prisoner transport we supposedly have scheduled." Sam's brow furrowed. "We have no midnight transport on the books." Breaker shook his head. "Right? The sheriff says he got a tip from federal agents claiming they'd be moving a high-value detainee. But that's not in our logs." Sam exhaled slowly. "That's how they're going to do it. They've planned some deception about a transport to cause confusion, or maybe to lure us into the open. They might intercept the supposed transport en route or stage an ambush near the road. Breaker's eyes flicked to the bank of cameras again. "We'll keep an eye out," they messaged Robert, who relayed the new intel to the rest of the team. The tension mounted. Hours ticked by in uneasy quiet. The facility locked down as the night deepened. Shortly after midnight, Robert was in the staff cafeteria, nursing a fresh cup of coffee. He stared through the small window at the moonlit desert. A memory surfaced, his first night drop into Afghanistan 25 years ago. The same bone-deep sense of readiness, the same hush in the air. That mission had left scars, both on his body and his conscience. He pushed the memory aside. Diego Alvarez brushed into the cafeteria, phone in hand. "Boss, my contact says the cartel is close. He heard something about them being under 2 hours out. They're traveling in multiple convoys, possibly splitting up to approach from different angles." Robert finished his coffee in one swift gulp, the bitter warmth stealing his resolve. So it begins. Already the staff was sparse at this late hour. Only a few night shift guards roamed the corridors. Robert grabbed his comm. "All units, stand by. Cartel likely inbound within the next 2 hours, maybe sooner. Stay sharp." His men confirmed, "Roger that, copy." Across the facility, stances shifted, eyes narrowed. Each operator melted into the background of normal facility security, but the heightened awareness was palpable. On the roof, Eagle Eye pressed the binoculars tighter against his face. Down by the garage, Red Jacobs performed a phantom inventory of weapons stashed in a locked cabinet, the kind of gear the average ICE guard never touched. Time oozed by, a slow drip of adrenaline and waiting. The minutes felt like hours. Robert found himself pacing the corridor, scanning bulletins on the wall out of sheer restlessness. He felt the old stir of anxiety, the knowledge that any second now, the gates of hell might open. At last, the facility's PA system crackled. Breaker's voice came through, carefully coded so as not to alarm the staff. "Chief Chandler, please report to the front gate." Robert's heart thudded. He made his way to the front entrance, where a small crowd of uniformed guards had gathered. Beyond the chain-link fence, a pair of headlights gleamed in the darkness. A large SUV rumbled to a stop. The occupant rolled down a window, revealing a middle-aged man with a thick mustache. He wore a crisp button-down shirt and an ID badge that looked suspiciously official. Jake from the guard booth squinted at a piece of paper. "He says he's from the local sheriff's office, here to escort a transport." Robert's gut churned. He stepped forward, forcing a polite smile. "Evening. May I help you?" The driver handed over a document. "We got word there was a detainee transfer tonight. Sheriff asked me to coordinate. They said the detainee was high value, extremely dangerous." The man had an accent, a faint Tex-Mex drawl. "Name's Manny Ortega, deputy out of Camden County." Robert's eyes scanned the man. Ortega's badge looked new, the edges too crisp, the hologram faint. The man's posture screamed tension. This was no seasoned deputy. Robert's mind whirred. They were testing the waters, checking if the infiltration story they'd spread was believable. "I see." Robert glanced at the paper. It was an order for detainee transfer, but the official seals looked off, as if they'd been hastily photocopied. "We don't have any scheduled transport tonight. Are you sure you're at the right facility?" "That's what the sheriff told me," Ortega persisted, feigning confusion. "He said to come out here around midnight." Robert maintained a casual tone but stepped aside, giving a signal behind his back. One of the real IC guards approached, also examining the document. Robert seized the moment. "Could you step out of the vehicle, sir? We'll straighten this out inside." Ortega blinked, hesitation flickering across his face. Sure." Robert sensed the man was debating whether to follow instructions or bolt. After a tense second, Ortega opened the SUV door. He stepped out, leaving the engine running. Robert motioned for the ICE guard to keep an eye on the SUV. Just then, another guard came up, gesturing to Robert. "There's a call for you from the Camden County Sheriff's Office. Something about no knowledge of a detainee transfer." That was all Robert needed. Ortega realized the jig was up. His hand shot to his waistband. Robert was faster. Before the man could draw, Robert lunged forward, one swift motion capturing Ortega's wrist and twisting it back in a submission hold. Ortega let out a strangled yell, dropping a hidden sidearm to the dirt. "Gun!" shouted a guard, stepping back in alarm. Another guard instinctively reached for his holster. Robert pinned Ortega against the side of the SUV, maintaining control of the suspect's arm. "Weapon recovered," he called, ignoring the adrenaline pumping in his veins. "Cuff him." A stunned Jake darted forward with handcuffs, snapping them onto Ortega's wrists. The situation had escalated from suspicious to near deadly in the blink of an eye. Robert's breath came slow and steady, his mind coldly calm as he scanned the perimeter. The night remained still, no sign of immediate reinforcements. Ortega cursed under his breath in Spanish, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. Robert nodded at one of the ICE guards. "Take him inside for questioning. Don't let him out of your sight." As Ortega was led away, Robert reached for his comm. "They're close." This was a probe. He spoke low enough that only the disguised Delta men would catch his words. "All positions on high alert." Eagle Eye's voice crackled back. "Copy that, boss. I see movement in the distance about 3 miles out on the highway. Headlights, possibly 3 sets." Red Jacobs added, "Sensors are picking up vibrations, lots of them. Could be more vehicles approaching off-road." Robert exhaled. The storm had arrived. He turned to the wide-eyed ICE guards around him, who were just beginning to grasp the gravity of the situation. His voice came out steady, authoritative. "Lock down the front gate. No one in or out unless cleared by me. This man is part of a criminal attempt to breach the facility. Prepare yourselves." He didn't add that these criminals belonged to one of the most brutal cartels in Mexico. Instead, he kept the staff's focus sharp and gave them tasks, reassuring them with confidence as best he could. Underneath the calm veneer, he braced for war. Outside the chain-link fence, beyond the range of the facility's floodlights, more vehicles were assembling. Engines rumbled in the darkness. Men readied their weapons, and a single voice on a radio crackled into the cool desert air. "Initiate the plan." Moonlight bathed the desert in pale silver as 3 SUVs idled a mile away from the detention facility, hidden behind a rocky outcropping. Their occupants busied themselves with final checks, loading magazines, attaching suppressors, and distributing tactical vests emblazoned with the Santa Rosa Cartel's black scorpion emblem. The man in charge was a tall figure in a dark windbreaker, a skull tattoo curling up his neck. He was known as Vicente El Tiburon Casillas, a lieutenant in the Santa Rosa Cartel, an apex predator once rumored to have survived a firefight against rival narcos, where he was the only survivor. With the last of his men stepping out of the SUVs, he checked the time on his watch. Ortega should have reported back by now. The fact that he hadn't boded ill. El Tiburon frowned, glancing at a henchman carrying a satellite phone. "Anything?" The henchman shook his head. No response from Ortega. They might have taken him. A string of curses hissed between El Tiburon's teeth. He turned to the rest of the men. "If Ortega's compromised, they'll be on alert. We do this fast and we do it hard. Some of us will draw fire at the front gate. The rest will circle around back, through the service road. We find El Zurdo and we get out." "Understood." A chorus of affirmatives in Spanish rumbled back. They were about 15 men strong, all armed with assault rifles and sidearms, some with bolt cutters and small charges for breaching. El Tiburon's gaze flicked to the horizon, where the detention facility's lights glimmered like a fortress. He rolled his shoulders, as if about to step into a ring. This was not the original plan. The infiltration with fake credentials was supposed to be quiet. But it seemed stealth was no longer an option. He raised a hand in signal. The engines revved low, and the convoy began to move through the sandy terrain, half-circling the facility. They would soon split into two prongs of attack. Back in the facility's security office, Sam Tien and Breaker watched the monitors intently. The exterior cameras showed nothing at the front gate, but the motion sensors on the west side flicked erratically. Breaker muttered, "They're shifting to the side, possibly trying to flank us. The sensors are picking up multiple footprints or vehicles in that direction." Sam nodded, toggling cameras. "I'm scanning the southwestern approach, near that service road." Diego Alvarez burst into the room, breathless. "They're jamming partial frequencies. I just lost contact with my source. We might be facing comm interference soon." Breaker rapidly typed on his console. "I can switch to a backup frequency, but it won't hold if they up the wattage on their jamming gear." He glanced at Sam. "We should keep local communications short and sweet." Sam's jaw set. "Do it." They radioed Robert and the rest of the men. Each operator was now fully in mission mode. Tactical gear that had been discreetly locked away was quietly deployed. Pistols and rifles, legally purchased for the official security team but with extensive modifications, were now loaded. Protective vests were donned under uniforms, as nonchalantly as possible so as not to alarm the regular staff more than they already were. Robert, hearing the update, strode to the front gate. He saw the tension on the guards' faces. "Any sign of movement?" Jake shook his head nervously. "Not directly, sir. Just quiet out there." Robert nodded. "Stay behind cover if anything happens. We'll handle the heavy lifting." He patted Jake on the shoulder, then moved to a vantage point near some concrete barriers. Beside him, Mojo crouched, scanning the gloom with night vision binoculars. "I count 3 SUVs approaching from the west," Mojo breathed. "They're keeping lights off, but the shape's unmistakable." Robert stifled a curse. "They'll probably try a diversion at the front gate, or the power station at the northwest corner. Standard tactic to cut lights. Keep your eyes on them." Red Jacobs jogged up, carrying a suppressed rifle slung across his back. "Boss, the staff's barricading inside. I told them to hold tight, keep heads down." "Good. Let's keep the staff out of the line of fire. This is our show." Moments later, the tension snapped. Gunfire erupted at the western perimeter. The crisp pop-pop-pop of suppressed rifles rattled the night. Robert's earpiece crackled. "This is Eagle Eye on the roof. I see muzzle flashes at the service entrance. They're hitting the fence. Looks like 6 men." Robert nodded, as if Eagle Eye could see him. "Take them if you have a clear shot." From the rooftop vantage, Eagle Eye leveled a specialized DMR, designated marksman rifle. He zeroed in on the flicker of muzzle flashes, caught a glimpse of 2 cartel gunmen cutting through the fence with bolt cutters. His finger squeezed the trigger once, twice. The muzzle barely kicked. Through the scope, he watched both targets drop. In the control room, Sam Tien updated the status over comms. 2 hostiles neutralized. The rest are pulling back. But this was only the opening salvo. The real hammer fell at the main gate seconds later, with an ear-splitting crash as a battered pickup, disguised behind the shadow of the SUVs, smashed into the checkpoint barrier. Guards scattered, shouting. Gunmen poured out of the vehicles, unleashing a hail of bullets at the security cameras and floodlights. Jake ducked behind the guard booth, frantically returning fire with his standard-issue sidearm. The cartel, emboldened by their numerical advantage, spread out to flank the booth. Before Jake could register what was happening, a bullet ripped through the booth's glass. He dropped to the floor, hands shaking. Robert and Mojo were already moving. They sprinted across open ground, forging a path behind concrete blocks. Bullets pinged off metal and stone. One guard gasped, taking a round to his shoulder, and crumpled to the ground. Robert slid next to him, dragging the wounded man to cover while Mojo returned suppressive fire. In the glare of muzzle flashes, Robert glimpsed a few key details. About 4 or 5 heavily armed cartel shooters near the gate, and more in the background. The distinct shape of an armored SUV behind them. This was a full frontal assault. "Mojo, you good?" Robert barked over the din. "I'm good," came the response, though his eyes burned with the adrenaline of combat. He changed magazines, pivoted, fired short bursts into the darkness. One cartel gunman spun and fell, flailing. The facility floodlights flickered, then died. The darkness swallowed everything. They hit the power junction. Breaker's voice shouted into Robert's earpiece. "Switching to backup generators now." For a few seconds, everything was chaotic darkness, broken only by sporadic muzzle flashes and the dancing beam of flashlights. Then the emergency lights flickered on, drenching the area in red. Alarms blared. Robert's mind raced. The main gate was compromised, but the interior doors and gates leading inside were still locked down. The cartel had to push deeper if they wanted El Zurdo. He had to funnel them into kill zones before they reached the detainee blocks. He tapped his comm again. "Red, Eagle Eye, converge on the main gate from the flank. Pin them down. Sam, lockdown protocol Bravo. Override all interior doors from central control. They don't get in unless we open the way." Sam's voice crackled back. "Initiating. They won't breach electronically, but they might blow the doors if they have the explosives. We'll be ready." Robert risked a glance around the concrete barrier. Through the gloom, he saw a cartel gunman racing toward the facility's front entrance, carrying what looked like shaped charges. He aimed and squeezed the trigger. The man crumpled, the explosives clattering to the ground. Meanwhile, Red Jacobs and Eagle Eye advanced from the side, cutting through the swirling dust and scattered debris. Red's suppressed rifle spat quietly, and another cartel thug went down. But with the darkness and confusion, the cartel retained an advantage in numbers. Gunshots echoed from multiple angles. Suddenly, a figure loomed out of the darkness behind Red, raising a pistol. Eagle Eye pivoted, but not fast enough. The figure squeezed the trigger. Click. A misfire. Red spun, seizing the moment. His rifle but crashed into the attacker's face, dropping him instantly. Red exhaled raggedly, adrenaline surging. In the command center, Sam Tien and Breaker scrambled to keep cameras functioning. The backup generators provided partial lighting, enough to illuminate some corridors, but external cameras were glitching. The jamming device the cartel had was messing with certain feeds. "I can't see them clearly anymore," Breaker murmured, eyes glued to the screens. "We're practically blind out there." Sam typed furiously, diverting system resources to critical cameras. "We need eyes on the detainee blocks." One feed popped into clarity, showing a corridor leading to El Zurdo's cell block. Guards were stationed there, wide-eyed, weapons drawn. Breaker rubbed his forehead. "I hope those guards can hold out until the boss cleans up out front." Outside, Robert and Mojo crept around the bullet-riddled guard booth, checking on Jake. The guard was conscious, though pale. I'm good," Jake stammered, pressing a hand to the wound on his shoulder. "Stay down," Robert ordered. "We'll get you help." Behind them, the cartel assault had slowed, the initial burst of aggression tempered by unexpected resistance. El Tiburon stepped forward from behind an SUV, scanning the battlefield with narrowed eyes. He recognized professional counterfire, the tight grouping of bullet impacts, the swift neutralization of his forward elements. "Who the hell are these guys?" he growled in Spanish. ducking as another barrage peppered his position. He clutched a radio. "Team 2, you better be through that fence by now. We're pinned at the gate." A voice crackled back. "They've got a sniper on the roof. We lost 2 men trying to get through. Attempting a different entry point." El Tiburon cursed. This was supposed to be a simple infiltration. He couldn't have known the facility was guarded by men who fought like elite commandos. And time was ticking. If they didn't breach soon, more authorities would be on the way. He glanced around, noticing one of his men with a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. A cruel grin crossed his face. "Blow that guard booth to kingdom come. Give us a distraction." The man nodded, hefting the RPG. He aimed at the booth, half obscured by the red emergency lighting. The whoosh of the rocket was deafening. Robert, still crouched nearby, felt the ground tremble as the explosion rocked the area. Shards of metal and concrete flew in a lethal arc. Smoke billowed, forcing Robert and Mojo to dive for cover. Jake let out a startled cry inside the booth as half the structure disintegrated. Fire and dust filled Robert's vision. His ears rang. He crawled, ignoring the jagged debris. The acrid smell of smoke and gunpowder stung his nostrils. "Mojo?" he called. Mojo appeared through the haze, coughing but unhurt. "We gotta move, boss." They retreated behind another barrier as sporadic gunfire continued. The cartel seized the moment of chaos, advancing closer to the facility entrance. High above, Eagle Eye tried to get a bead on the man with the RPG, but swirling smoke obscured the target. By the time the wind shifted, the man had ducked behind a wrecked SUV. Frustration gnawed at Eagle Eye. He needed a clear shot, or they'd risk another devastating explosion. Robert tapped his comm. "Situation update, Sam." Sam's voice came back, crackling with tension. "Multiple hostiles have cut the fence at the rear. They're heading for the D-block entrance. I'm locking down interior doors, but if they breach with explosives, it won't hold for long." Adrenaline surged through Robert's veins. The cartel was launching a multi-pronged assault. They had to split up. "Mojo, Red, take the west side. Stop them from reaching D-block. I'll hold the front with Eagle Eye. Diego, do you copy?" "Copy, boss," Diego's voice replied. "I'm inside, near the detainee blocks. I'll coordinate with the guards. We won't let them pass." Robert braced against a concrete pillar, returning fire at the advancing gunman. "Go," he told Mojo and Red, who took off, darting between cover toward the west side of the compound. One of the cartel's vehicles attempted to ram the main entrance again, but Robert planted 3 shots into the windshield. The driver slumped, and the SUV veered, smashing into a wall with a screech of tortured metal. Another explosion somewhere behind the facility rattled the structure. The cartel was pressing in from all sides. Sweat drenched Robert's brow, and his breathing was ragged. Yet in the swirl of chaos, he felt an odd sense of clarity. This was the environment he understood. An asymmetric battleground where cunning, discipline, and skill often outweighed raw numbers. These cartel foot soldiers were dangerous, but they lacked the polished coordination of a special forces unit. He reloaded, pivoting around the pillar. A group of 4 cartel thugs took cover behind the twisted wreck of a pickup. One popped up to spray bullets in Robert's direction. Robert ducked, waited a beat, then rose to deliver 2 precise shots. The gunman collapsed. The rest scrambled to find new cover. Still, the cartel momentum was undeniable. They were pushing closer to the facility's main doors, even if they paid a heavy price in casualties. Robert couldn't hold them off alone, and Eagle Eye's vantage was partially neutralized by the lingering smoke and the angle of the vehicles. Suddenly, the comm crackled with Levi Thorson's urgent tone. "Boss, I got a partial shot on their leader. He's directing them from behind that SUV, next to the second gate. Should I take it?" Robert peered through the gloom, caught a glimpse of the tall figure in a windbreaker. The man had a commanding presence, shouting orders, gesturing wildly. "Yeah, Eagle Eye," Robert confirmed. "Take the shot." Up on the roof, Levi exhaled steadily, aligning his crosshairs. Through the swirling dust, the man's face flickered in and out of the scope's night vision. Just as Levi squeezed the trigger, the man moved. The bullet sparked against metal, missing by mere inches. The figure whipped around, scanning the roofline, then ducked. "Damn it," Levi muttered. He tried again, but the man was gone. A second later, a bullet zinged past Levi's cover, forcing him to hunch down. The cartel had spotted his position and was now returning fire. Below, Robert heard more footsteps pounding on the dirt, the guttural shouts of cartel reinforcements. They seemed endless, though the reality was that many had already fallen. The detention facility now felt like a war zone. Just as Robert considered pulling back to regroup, his comms sizzled with frantic energy. "Robert, we have a situation." Diego's normally calm voice was edged with alarm. "They've breached the corridor leading to El Zurdo's cell block. I'm pinned down. Boss, they're heading straight for him." A thunderous vibration rattled the corridors of the detention facility, shaking dust from the ceiling tiles. Alarms wailed in discordant shrieks. Diego Alvarez pressed himself against a wall in a narrow hallway, gun at the ready. Up ahead, a trio of cartel gunmen huddled behind an overturned metal cart, exchanging sporadic gunfire with a pair of IC guards pinned at the far end. Diego felt his heart hammering. He had fought in urban warfare zones before, but something about seeing these corridors, meant to house petty criminals or detainees awaiting immigration hearings, turned into a battleground, unsettled him. Still, training took over and he stayed calm. He clicked his calm, "Boss, can you send backup?" Static greeted him at first, then Robert's voice crackled through. "We're trying. Sam Tien's coordinating. Hold as long as you can." The line went dead again. Diego cursed under his breath. The jamming was messing with comms. He peeked around the corner. One cartel gunman advanced, flicking a flashbang around the next bend. A deafening pop resounded, white light flooding the hall. The ICE guards reeled, momentarily blinded. Diego seized the opening, slipping around the far side. In two controlled bursts, he took down the advancing gunman and another who tried to pop out behind him. A third turned, returning fire with a short-barrel rifle. Bullets ricocheted off the cinder-block walls. Diego ducked, feeling shards of concrete graze his neck. The ICE guards, recovering from the flash, fired blindly. One round found the third assailant's leg, sending him sprawling. Diego sprang forward, securing the man's weapon with a swift kick. Then he motioned for the guards to hold their fire. The gunman groaned in Spanish, clutching his leg, cursing. In the flickering red emergency lights, Diego assessed the hallway. "You too," he called to the guards. "Keep that man secured. We can't let them take D-block." The lead guard, trembling, nodded. "Why, yes, sir." Diego nodded back and continued, carefully navigating the labyrinth of corridors. The facility's architecture was standard for a detention center, a series of cell blocks branching off main corridors, each secured by heavy steel doors and electronically controlled gates. The deeper one went, the more secure it got, especially for high-risk detainees like El Zurdo. He found a T-intersection leading to D-block. The blast door was sealed, the lock engaged, but overhead lights flickered alarmingly. If the cartel had the right charges or codes, they could breach that door. And from the sounds of distant gunfire echoing through the halls, they were trying just that. Diego glanced to his right. Another corridor branched toward administrative offices. He caught movement in the corner of his vision, a black silhouette. Ducking behind a half-wall, he glimpsed two more cartel soldiers creeping carefully, scanning for threats. They wore tactical vests and carried submachine guns. A faint smell of smoke drifted in from behind them. Diego's instincts roared. He quietly radioed for any nearby friendly to converge, but the static indicated no help was coming soon. He'd have to handle this himself. Easing his suppressed pistol into a better grip, he slowed his breathing. These two men carried themselves with a certain confidence, ex-military perhaps. They weren't panicked or flailing. They moved methodically, checking corners. As they drew closer, Diego squeezed off 2 shots, hitting the first man in the chest. The second spun, returning fire. A bullet whined off the wall, missing Diego by inches. Diego ducked, rolled across the corridor, then fired again. The second man dropped, weapon clattering on the linoleum floor. Diego wiped sweat from his brow and pressed on. He reached the sealed blast door leading to D-block. Through the reinforced glass window set high in the steel, he could see flickers of muzzle flash. More cartel gunmen were on the other side, apparently trying to break the emergency lock. Meanwhile, behind them, detainees in the cells were shouting in panic, some hollering for help, others cursing in Spanish. Several hammered on their cell bars, hoping for some advantage in the chaos. Inside the corridor, the cartel had forced a wedge into the blast door frame, and they were placing a small explosive charge. If that door blew, they'd have direct access to El Zurdo's cell block. No time to wait, Diego thought. He took a shaky breath, then hammered the control panel on his side, forcibly overriding the safety release. With a hiss, the door slid open just enough for him to toss a flashbang inside. He immediately hit the emergency close button, bracing for the blast. A thunderous pop shook the door, accompanied by screams of disorientation from within. Diego punched the override again, and the steel door slid open. In a swirl of smoke and flashing lights, he charged in, weapon raised. The 2 or 3 men nearest the door were incapacitated by the flashbang, clutching their ears, eyes squeezed shut. Diego dispatched them swiftly, muzzle flashes illuminating the cramped corridor. But the others had enough distance to recover. A tall figure with a spider tattoo on his neck spun, firing an automatic burst from an Uzi. Diego dove behind a large metal trash bin, bullets pinging. He heard the detainees shrieking, cowering in their cells. One cry rose above the chaos. "Don't shoot us, man! We're locked in here." Diego grit his teeth. He needed to end this firefight before innocent detainees got hit. Risking a glance, he saw at least 4 more armed cartel men near the far end of the hall. One of them looked older, with a thick mustache and an air of authority. He barked orders, gesturing toward a reinforced cell door. That had to be El Zurdo's cell. They wasted no time. While the spider-tattooed man kept Diego suppressed, 2 others began attaching a shaped charge to El Zurdo's locked cell door. Once they blew it, El Zurdo would be free and in cartel custody. Diego couldn't let that happen. He clicked his comm, hoping for any backup. "This is Alvarez, D-block corridor. They're about to breach El Zurdo's cell. For hostiles. Need immediate assistance." All he got in return was static. The jamming was too strong inside these walls. He was on his own. With adrenaline coursing through his veins, Diego shifted his pistol to his left hand and reached for a smoke grenade in his vest. He pulled the pin, tossed it toward the group at the far end. Immediately, white smoke billowed, obscuring visibility. Amid the confusion, he crept along the opposite wall, ducking low. The spider-tattooed man unleashed wild bursts into the haze, bullets smashing into walls and cell bars. Detainees screamed and dove for cover. Diego slid across the floor, ignoring the searing ache in his knees. He closed the distance. One of the men coughed, hacking up smoke. Diego took aim, placing 2 shots center mass. Another tried to spin, but was too slow. Diego's next round found him. The older ringleader with the mustache roared in Spanish, firing blindly as he backed away from the swirling smoke. A sudden crackle of static made Diego's earpiece come alive. Breaker's voice. "Alvarez, do you read? You have incoming from behind." Diego's eyes widened, but before he could respond, a booted foot slammed into his side, knocking him off balance. He hit the floor hard, pistol skittering away. Through stinging eyes, he saw the spider-tattooed man, still alive, towering over him with a jagged combat knife. Reacting on instinct, Diego rolled to one side, narrowly avoiding a downward slash that sparked against the concrete. He scrambled for his pistol, but the man kicked it away, sending it under a row of benches. The man lunged again, forcing Diego to grab his wrist to keep the blade from plunging into his chest. They grappled, feet sliding in the haze of gunpowder and smoke. With a growl, the attacker freed his knife hand, slicing across Diego's forearm. Pain flared. Diego hissed, ignoring the blood as best he could. His other hand fumbled at his belt. In a burst of desperation, he yanked out a small folding knife and drove it into the man's thigh. The attacker howled, momentarily loosening his grip. Diego seized the chance, twisting free, then snatching a fallen pistol from a cartel corpse. He fired point blank. The spider-tattooed man went limp, collapsing to the floor. Gasping for breath, Diego rose unsteadily. Another bullet whizzed past, forcing him to duck behind a steel support beam. The older mustached man was still standing, cursing Diego in Spanish, leveling his weapon. In a cold flash of recognition, Diego realized who it was: Eduardo Vargas, a known lieutenant of Santa Rosa, rumored to be second or third in the hierarchy. If Vargas was here personally, this infiltration was even more critical than they had assumed. Vargas barked, "Stand down or die, pendejo." Diego said nothing. He pressed up against the beam, carefully sliding a fresh magazine into the pistol. Pain seared his arm from the knife wound, but he forced himself to focus. A frantic detainee screamed from a nearby cell, "Look out! Behind you!" Diego snapped around just in time to see a cartel gunman appear through a side corridor. The man aimed a rifle, but Diego dropped to one knee and fired first. The gunman's body jerked, then hit the ground with a dull thump. A sudden explosion rocked the hallway, smaller than expected, but enough to tear open El Zurdo's cell door. Apparently, the shaped charge had still been set or triggered. Sparks and twisted metal showered the corridor. Detainees in nearby cells shrieked even louder. Diego's heart pounded. If El Zurdo was now free, the entire mission was compromised. And given the swirling dust and smoke, it was hard to see what was happening at the far end. That's when the older lieutenant, Vargas, emerged from behind the haze, grabbing El Zurdo by the arm. The detainee looked disoriented but uninjured. He was a wiry man in his early 40s, eyes darting in frantic excitement. He wore an orange detention jumpsuit, half-charred from the explosion. Vargas pressed a pistol to El Zurdo's side, using him as a human shield, and began retreating down the corridor. "Cover me!" he shouted to whoever was left alive among his men. One or two survivors still lurked in the smoke, returning sporadic fire to keep Diego pinned. El Zurdo rasped, You came for me. Gracias, man." Vargas smirked grimly. "We're not out yet." Diego rose, exchanging fire with the last pair of gunmen. They returned a furious volley. Sparks leapt from the walls as ricochets zinged. One bullet seared across Diego's shoulder, eliciting a sharp grunt of pain. In the flicker of emergency lights, Diego glimpsed Vargas hauling El Zurdo around a corner that led toward a service exit. If they reached that exit, the cartel could whisk El Zurdo away into the night, leaving the facility reeling. Diego had to stop them. Clamping a hand over his bleeding forearm, he forced himself to charge forward. The two remaining gunmen realized his intent and opened fire. Diego dove behind a thick structural column. He popped off shots in quick succession, felling one. The last man cursed in Spanish, then peeled away to follow Vargas, presumably to ensure a safe escape route. Diego emerged from the column, panting, but unstoppable. He ignored the dizzying swirl of red lights and the sharp tang of blood in the air. He sprinted after them down corridors he knew well. The facility's layout gave him a slight advantage. He knew a shortcut to the service exit that might let him intercept them. Swiping a keycard at a security door, he cut through a staff-only hallway. He burst into a small supply area, stumbling from blood loss and exertion, but pressing on. He could hear faint footsteps echoing beyond the next door. He kicked open the door. A startled cartel gunman spun, rifle raised, near the threshold of the service exit. Diego double-tapped him, the muzzle flash lighting the small utility space. The man fell heavily. Just beyond him, Vargas and El Zurdo froze. The exit door was mere steps away, open a crack to the outside, letting in a breath of cool desert air. Vargas whipped his pistol up, but Diego was faster. He fired, catching Vargas in the shoulder. The older man staggered, dropping his gun with a snarl. El Zurdo, eyes wide, lunged for the dropped weapon. Diego trained his sights on the detainee. "Don't!" he barked in Spanish. El Zurdo sneered, ignoring the command. His fingers curled around the pistol. Diego had no choice. He fired. The bullet struck El Zurdo's arm, causing him to shriek and collapse. The weapon clattered to the floor. Panting, Diego advanced, covering both men. Vargas glared hatefully, pressing a hand to his bleeding shoulder. El Zurdo writhed on the floor, clutching his wounded limb, cursing in Spanish. The standoff lasted mere seconds. But in that moment, a swirl of revelations flooded Diego's mind. They had nearly succeeded. If not for a few crucial delays, Santa Rosa would have El Zurdo in hand already. "Try anything and I finish it," Diego warned, pistol unwavering. Before either man could respond, the exit door flung wide. A new figure burst in, a cartel soldier who must have been stationed outside. He aimed a submachine gun at Diego's back. Diego sensed the movement, pivoting too slowly. The muzzle flashed. In a whirl of motion, Diego dove behind a row of shelves, bullets tearing into the plasterboard behind him. Vargas scrambled for cover, and El Zurdo dragged himself out of the line of fire, whimpering. Diego, pinned behind the shelves, counted footsteps. The new arrival advanced carefully. Diego had one magazine left, and no illusions about who was the better position. Suddenly, a thunderous retort echoed from the hallway behind them. The cartel soldier stiffened, eyes rolling back, then collapsed. Standing in the corridor was Sam Tien, sidearm smoking. "You okay?" Sam called, stepping into the supply area, scanning for threats. Diego let out a shaky exhale. "Been better." He gestured to Vargas and El Zurdo. "We got them." Sam nodded curtly, kicking the pistol away from El Zurdo's reach. He keyed his comm breaker. "We have El Zurdo in custody. Repeat, the package is secure. We also have a high-value Santa Rosa lieutenant. Need medical and more restraints." Breaker's voice was euphoric. "Copy that, sending a team now." Even as Sam and Diego secured Vargas and El Zurdo, an urgent call came in from Robert's channel. His words were tight with alarm. "They've got bigger guns than we thought. Another wave is coming, heavily armed. We need every man we can get at the front. Hurry!" The stench of burning rubber and scorched metal choked the night air around the detention facility's front gate. Scraps of twisted steel littered the ground where vehicles had crashed or been neutralized. Flickering flames licked up from the remnants of a guard booth. Occasionally, stray rounds hissed through the darkness, fired by desperate cartel gunmen refusing to surrender. Robert Chandler crouched behind a mangled SUV, reloading with practiced efficiency. His arms felt like lead from the prolonged firefight, and his throat burned from inhaling smoke. But there was no time to rest. Above him, Eagle Eye scanned for targets from the rooftop, struggling with the drifting plumes of smoke that obscured his line of sight. Mojo slid in beside Robert, breathing hard. One of the main hostiles, the guy calling shots up front, he's pulled back. We think he's regrouping somewhere in the perimeter. Robert nodded, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. El Tiburon, he's no amateur. He'll be planning his next move. Mojo tossed Robert a fresh magazine. You all right, boss? You've got that look. Robert gave a grim smile. I'm fine. Then, into his calm, Sam, sit rep on El Zerto? Sam Tien's voice crackled back. Secure. Diego's with me. We also bagged a Santa Rosa lieutenant named Vargas. We're moving them to a lockdown cell for extra security. Robert exhaled relief. Good work. Now get back out here. El Tiburon's not finished. A sudden rumble from the distance made Robert and Mojo exchange glances. It sounded like an engine powerful, bigger than the SUVs the cartel had used. The low growl intensified, accompanied by the glare of headlights cresting a nearby slope. Eagle Eye radioed from above. Incoming west side. Looks like a... What the hell is that? Some sort of truck. Possibly an armored pickup with a mounted turret on the back. Robert's stomach dropped. So that's the bigger hammer. Within seconds, the massive vehicle rolled into view, bristling with makeshift armor plating. A belt-fed machine gun was mounted in the truck bed, manned by 2 cartel soldiers. The ugly machine looked like a cross between a stolen military surplus truck and a Mad Max contraption. It roared closer, headlights sweeping the facility gates. The engines roar a menacing crescendo. Mojo muttered a curse. That turret will tear us apart if we don't take it out now. Robert nodded sharply. He keyed the comm team. We have a heavily armored truck with a mounted MG inbound at the front gate. Eagle Eye, you got anything that can punch through armor? Levi's voice came back. We have an armor-piercing rifle in the emergency armory, but it's locked. Red's heading to retrieve it. Robert motioned for Mojo to follow him. They darted behind debris, inching closer to a vantage point where they could ambush the truck as it advanced. The acrid smell of burning gasoline filled Robert's nostrils. He was all too aware that the standard ICE guards were completely outmatched. This was up to his team. The truck halted about 50 yards from the wreckage, engine revving, the turret swiveling menacingly. A figure, presumably El Tiburon, climbed down from the driver's side. He barked orders, and the turret gunner began spraying bullets across the facility's entrance, shredding metal barriers and peppering the walls with lethal rounds. Robert flattened himself behind the remains of a concrete barricade. Bullets whizzed overhead, producing an eerie whining that set every nerve on edge. This was a different kind of fight now, a direct onslaught from a heavy weapon. If the cartel pinned them down, they could force an opening and slip inside. Somewhere behind the facility's walls, a smaller explosion rocked the compound, accompanied by a flicker of red emergency lights. Robert's heart lurched, hoping it wasn't Sam or Diego, but there was no time to check. He shouted to Mojo over the din. We can't let that turret keep firing. We need a diversion until Red gets here with the big gun. Mojo wiped sweat from his brow, scanning the area. His gaze locked on the remains of a forklift that had been used for deliveries. It was parked near an overturned truck, close enough to be in potential range of the machine gun. If I can get that forklift moving, maybe I can provide some cover. Or ram that beast. Robert hesitated. It's a death trap if they see you. I'll stay low and use the debris as cover. If I can get close enough, I'll jam the forks right under the truck side. Might flip it or at least tilt it. That'll give Eagle Eye a clear shot at the turret. A hail of bullets hammered their barricade, sending dust cascading down in choking clouds. Robert considered the plan. It was risky, pure desperation. But with time slipping away, they had few other options. "Go," Robert said. "I'll lay down suppressive fire." Mojo nodded. In a crouch, he darted behind the twisted metal remains of the front gate, pausing whenever the turret gunner pivoted the weapon away. Robert popped up just enough to fire a barrage of shots at the truck, forcing the gunner to duck. Sparks ricocheted off the improvised armor plating, leaving barely a dent. Meanwhile, Mojo managed to reach the forklift. He climbed onto it, fumbling with the ignition. After a terrifying few seconds, the engine sputtered to life. He kept the forks low to the ground and began rolling forward, using the thick smoke from burning vehicles as partial cover. El Tiburon spotted the movement and yelled to his gunner, pointing at the forklift. The turret swung around. Robert gritted his teeth and unleashed another volley, aiming at the gunner's silhouette. He didn't have to hit him, just force him to duck long enough for Mojo to get in position. A burst of machine gun fire shredded the forklift's metal cage, missing Mojo by inches. Still, the forklift lurched onward, inching closer to the truck. The ground shook from the blasts of gunfire. Robert felt as if he was in a slow-motion nightmare, each second stretching into eternity. In the flickering glow, Robert spotted a figure on the rooftop, eagle-eye, armed with the newly retrieved anti-material rifle. Red Jacobs must have delivered it. Now Eagle-Eye set up quickly, ignoring the bullets pinging off the facility's facade. He lined up the massive rifle, scanning for a vulnerable spot on the truck's armor. But the turret operator was spraying the rooftop, anticipating a sniper. Eagle-Eye ducked, narrowly avoiding a hail of rounds that chipped off chunks of the concrete ledge. Mojo, meanwhile, made his final surge. The forklift rattled, moving at top speed, still sluggish compared to normal vehicles. The turret gunner whirled, trying to draw a bead. Robert timed another burst, his last few rounds slamming into the truck's side. The gunner flinched, drawn off target. Then the forklift crashed into the truck's flank with a teeth-rattling jolt. The forks wedged under the improvised armor plating, lifting the truck's side wheels off the ground. Sparks flew, and the squeal of stressed metal tore through the night. The turret swung wildly, bullets spraying harmlessly into the air. Inside the cabin, El Tiburon cursed, struggling to keep the truck from tipping. Now was Eagle-Eye's moment. High above the chaos, he rose to one knee, sighted in on the turret mount. The muzzle of the big rifle flashed once, thunder splitting the air. The heavy armor-piercing round punched through the side of the turret, striking the gunner in a spray of sparks. The gunner slumped, and the machine gun went silent. Cheers broke out among the scattered ICE guards huddled behind cover. Robert felt a rush of triumph, but the fight wasn't over. El Tiburon shoved the door open, jumping clear of the listing truck before it could fully tip. He rolled across the dirt, crouching low, scanning for his next move. Mojo tried reversing the forklift, but the truck's weight pinned him. Flames started licking up from the forklift's damaged engine. "Damn it!" he growled, unstrapping himself. He jumped off, rolling away just before the whole forklift burst into flames, sending a plume of black smoke skyward. El Tiburon used the confusion to scramble behind another battered SUV. Robert took aim, but the man moved fast. He might still have reinforcements. Cartel foot soldiers were scattered around, some lying low, some wounded, some trying to regroup. The detention facility yard was a graveyard of twisted steel and shattered glass, the ground littered with shell casings. Panting, Robert reloaded, calling out, "Mojo, you okay?" Mojo clambered to his feet, covered in soot, coughing. "I'm alive. Gonna feel that in the morning." Eagle-Eye radioed. "Gunner's down, but the vehicle is still functional. The driver might try to get it loose." Robert watched with relief as no immediate driver replaced El Tiburon. The battered truck was pinned at an odd angle, its turret canted to one side. He turned his attention back to the SUV. We need to neutralize their leader. He's probably calling for more backup as we speak. Then a new voice crackled over the comm. Sam Tien. Robert, we secured El Zurdo and Vargas in a lockdown cell. They're not going anywhere. We're en route to you now. Robert replied, Good. Be careful out here. Heavy fighting still in progress. Not 10 seconds later, Sam and Diego appeared from the side entrance, weapons drawn, eyes scanning the carnage with a mixture of horror and readiness. Diego's arm was wrapped in a blood-stained makeshift bandage, but he moved with determination. They converged with Robert, Mojo, and a wide-eyed ice guard who had somehow survived the onslaught. Sam's gaze caught the pinned truck with the flaming forklift. Well, that's something you don't see every day. Mojo gave a shaky laugh. Desperate times. Robert's eyes flicked from ally to ally. Let's sweep the perimeter. Take out or capture any remaining cartel. Eagle Eye will provide overwatch. We end this now. The group fanned out. In the faint glow of the emergency lights and the flicker of scattered fires, they moved methodically, clearing pockets of resistance. Some cartel thugs attempted to flee, dropping weapons as they crawled through the torn fence. Others fought to the last, forcing short but brutal exchanges of gunfire. Robert advanced toward the last place he'd seen El Tiburon. His heart hammered with an odd blend of adrenaline and calm. The old Delta Force instincts roared within him. Step carefully. Check corners. Listen for movement. Keep muzzle discipline. He rounded the corner of a half-collapsed barrier. Movement flickered at the edge of his vision. He spun, weapon raised, only to see a wounded cartel soldier attempting to crawl away. Blood streaked the ground behind him. The man lifted a pistol shakily, but Robert kicked it aside, pressing him down with a boot. Stay, Robert barked, kneeling to zip-tie the man's hands. The soldier coughed, spitting blood. El Tiburon, Robert demanded in Spanish. Where is he? The wounded man's eyes flicked downward, refusing to speak. Robert didn't waste time. He signaled to a nearby ICE guard. Cuff him. Call medics. Continuing around the smoldering remains of the forklift, Robert heard faint scuffling. Carefully, he crept forward, muzzle leading. The swirl of smoke parted, revealing a battered chain-link corner. And there, crouched behind a chunk of corrugated steel, was El Tiburon, gun in hand. The man's eyes blazed with feral intensity, like a cornered predator. Robert leveled his weapon. Don't move, he commanded. El Tiburon smirked, blood trickling down his brow. You fight like Federals, but better. American Special Forces. He spoke in accented English. We had no idea. Robert's face remained impassive. Drop the gun. The cartel lieutenant stared back defiantly, chest heaving. Then, in one swift motion, he fired. Robert dove to the side, returning fire. Both men scrambled for cover behind the wreckage, bullets ricocheting off metal. Robert felt an old, familiar calm settle in his bones. This was the last stand. El Tiburon tried to flank around the barrier. Robert anticipated the move, flinging himself behind a half-buried hunk of concrete. He rose, sights locked on El Tiburon's center mass, fingers squeezing the trigger. The shot found its mark. El Tiburon jolted, staggering backward, dropping his pistol. He collapsed against the twisted metal, gasping. Robert approached, cautious. The man's eyes, still ablaze with hatred, flickered as his life drained away. There's more will come, El Tiburon rasped in Spanish. He coughed, blood on his lips. You can't stop us all. Robert stared, mind swirling. He'd heard those words before from warlords, terrorists, criminals. The enemy always believed they were legion, unstoppable. But that never stopped men like Robert from trying. Maybe, Robert said quietly, but we'll stop you tonight. El Tiburon's gaze clouded. and his head lolled. Robert stood there for a moment, the thunder of gunfire fading behind him. The clang of distant metal told him others were securing the perimeter. The onslaught had been horrific, but it appeared they'd repelled the main force. Exhaling, Robert keyed his comm, front yard secure. El Tiburon is down. Repeat, front yard secure. Slowly, the facility's alarms died to a dull wail. The fires smoldered, painting the sky with a toxic haze. Ice guards emerged from cover, checking on their wounded. Red Jacobs and Levi Thorson hurried over, weapons at the ready, scanning for any surviving threats. Sam and Diego approached from the other side, relief etched on their faces. Robert felt the tension in his muscles uncoil, though the adrenaline still coursed through his veins. The worst seemed over. They had kept the facility from falling, prevented El Zurdo from being liberated, and neutralized a large contingent of Santa Rosa gunmen. Bodies and burning wrecks told the tale of how ferocious the battle had been. Through the settling dust, Robert's radio came alive one last time, with Breaker's urgent tone. "Boss, we have a big problem. I just got word from the local sheriff's department. They say a second wave, larger, more heavily armed, just crossed the border. And they're heading our way." The courtyard of the Rio Grande Detention Facility was littered with the wreckage of war. Twisted metal, spent shells, and the smoldering husks of vehicles. The air still reeked of gunpowder and scorched rubber, and a dull roar of alarm klaxons pulsed against the night sky. Exhausted IC guards regrouped in clusters, some tending to wounded colleagues, others standing dazed, weapons clutched in trembling hands. Robert Chandler, still catching his breath, stepped away from El Tiburon's body. A quiet hush had fallen across the compound, like the collective inhale before another storm. Over the comm, Breaker's voice repeated the dire message. "A second wave is inbound. They're bigger, heavier, and they have an ETA of under 2 hours. Mojo, Sam, Diego, Red, and Eagle Eye converged around Robert, each bearing fresh scrapes, minor wounds, and the adrenaline-slick sheen of men who had fought through a deadly firefight and somehow survived. Their eyes, though grim with fatigue, still flashed with that unbreakable resolve of old Delta Force operators. Robert turned the volume up on his handheld radio so they could all hear Breaker's words. Sheriff's deputies along the highway saw at least 6 SUVs and 2 trucks crossing into Texas, rumored to be carrying heavy ordnance, maybe mortars or more turret guns. A hush cloaked the group, broken only by the crackle of distant flames. Diego cursed softly in Spanish, pressing a bloodied rag to his forearm. "We barely repelled the first wave. The second will have fresh fighters, more ammo, more gear. We're down to scraps." Mojo knelt to tie a fresh bandage around his own thigh, shaking his head. "They're not just trying to free El Zurdo anymore. They want payback for what happened tonight." Red Jacobs wiped sweat from his brow. "We need to fortify, bring in real reinforcements." Robert frowned. "We can't. Homeland Security is spread thin, and local law enforcement won't arrive in time to handle a paramilitary assault. Even if they did, they're not equipped for a full-on shootout with an armored convoy." Sam Tien glanced around, voice calm despite the chaos. "So we stand and fight again, but we do it smarter. We set traps, funnel them where we want them." Levi Eagle Eye Thorson nodded. "We still have vantage on the roof. Might even bring some heavier toys from storage. Doesn't the facility keep a small arsenal for riot control?" Robert rubbed his temples. It was true. ICE facilities sometimes had lockdown equipment, tear gas launchers, shotguns with breaching rounds, certain riot suppression munitions. None were as lethal as the specialized gear used by special operations, but it might be enough to tilt the odds. "We'll gather what we can, but we also need to move quickly. We can't defend every angle if they come en masse." Diego took a step closer, grimacing at the pain in his arm. Also, El Zurdo is a prime target, but what about the rest of the detainees? If the second wave storms in with more indiscriminate tactics, a lot of people could die. Robert felt the weight of it all. We can't relocate them in time. We have to reinforce from within. The strongest fallback point is the central cell block corridor. Thick walls, multiple security doors. He looked around the battered yard. But first, let's secure the perimeter. If we can't stop them out here, the inside will become a slaughterhouse. A flicker of movement drew their attention. The surviving IC personnel, many of them in shock, were now looking toward Robert and his men for guidance. The illusions were over. Whatever subtlety the former Delta operators maintained before was gone. The staff had seen these security contractors fight like an elite unit, and they were desperate for leadership. Robert strode to a position of higher ground, standing on a half-toppled stack of pallets, and raised his voice. "Listen up," he called. The scattered guards, battered but still breathing, turned expectant eyes on him. "We have a lull in the fighting," he said. "A second assault is coming heavier than the last. We need all able-bodied officers to regroup and follow our instructions. We'll form a perimeter defense, set up barricades, and reinforce choke points inside. We have to work together, or none of us walks out of here." Jake, the guard who had taken a bullet in the shoulder earlier, grimaced as he held his injured arm in a sling. "Mr. Chandler, whatever you need, just say the word." Robert nodded. "Good man. Start by rounding up the wounded and getting them to the infirmary. Anyone who can still hold a weapon, come see me for instructions." Over the next half hour, a ragtag system of triage, fortification, and scrounging took shape. The rest of Robert's team fanned out. Sam and Breaker returned to the control center, patching into any available law enforcement frequency. They also started rerouting emergency power to the facility's outer floodlights, hoping to keep the grounds illuminated for the impending assault. Mojo recruited a handful of uninjured guards to help position concrete barriers and improvise barricades across the western approach, where the first wave had broken through. Red and Eagle Eye checked rooftops and watchtowers, ensuring vantage points were manned and scanning every approach for approaching headlights. They found a single tear gas launcher in the riot locker and distributed canisters of irritant gas to ICE guards. Diego, his arm hastily stitched by the overworked nurse, organized detainees from the most vulnerable cell blocks, moving them to a more central location for their own safety. Nervous detainees hurled questions and curses in multiple languages, but the threat of the cartel's brutality hung in the stale air. Robert moved through the courtyard, checking on each station. Once or twice, he paused to kneel beside a dead cartel gunman, searching pockets for intel or phone devices that might reveal the second wave's plan. He found only half-charged burners and a scattering of ammunition. No direct leads. At last, the yard was as prepared as it could be under the circumstances. Temporary barricades formed a layered defense around the front gate. The fence lines had been patched with spare chain link, though the structural integrity was questionable at best. The dreaded bullet-riddled armored truck remained pinned under the forklift's twisted forks, still smoking, an eerie reminder of how close they had come to total breach. Robert's phone buzzed. Sam's voice whispered over the comm link, "Boss, local PD confirms the second wave is splitting into two convoys. They're about 30 miles out and closing fast. One is bigger, heading straight up the highway. The other is taking a back road, probably to flank us." Robert swallowed hard. He was bone-tired, every muscle aching, but the fight was only halfway done. Any sign they're coordinating with an aerial assault or drones? Nothing reported. Doesn't mean they won't have them. But as of now, we expect a ground assault only. All right. Robert let his gaze sweep the dark horizon. The first stars of night had reappeared, though they seemed dimmed by the swirling smoke. "We hold them off as long as we can. If it becomes untenable, we pull back into the facility and fortify the interior. Keep me posted. Sam acknowledged and Robert clicked off. He turned to find Diego approaching, pale but steady on his feet. All detainees who aren't severely injured are locked in central blocks, Diego said. Guard detail is doubled. If the fight spills inside again, we'll have to evacuate them deeper into the building. There's only so much space. Robert nodded, placing a reassuring hand on Diego's good shoulder. We'll deal with that if it happens. Good work. A distant rumble drifted across the desert air, the faint growl of engines on the highway. Robert's blood chilled. They were running out of time. Nearby, an IC guard hovered anxiously, as if he wanted to say something but was too intimidated. Robert beckoned him over. You got something? The guard looked younger than most, maybe mid-20s. He swallowed. Sir, I checked the body of that big guy, the one you took out. Found this. He handed Robert a folded document, stained with dried blood. Robert opened it carefully. It was a crude blueprint of the Rio Grande Detention Facility, likely bought on the black market or gleaned from some bribed contractor. The blueprint had hand-drawn arrows pointing to ventilation shafts, utility tunnels, and side entrances not commonly known, even some that Robert's own men had barely used. Robert's stomach churned. They know about the tunnels. Those tunnels were old utility passages beneath the facility, used mostly for water lines or to access certain mechanical rooms. They were rarely in use, but if left unsecured, a well-prepared assault team could slip inside and flank them from below, or set charges to bring the building down. He tapped his comm again. Breaker, Sam, do we have any motion sensors in the sublevel tunnels? Sam replied, a few, but they're ancient. We'll see if we can get them back online. Do it, Robert ordered. And we need men guarding those tunnel entrances. In the pit of his gut, he felt the entire playing field shift. The second wave might do more than simply ram the front gate. They could attack from multiple angles, even from below. The defenders were battered, short-staffed, and low on ammunition. But Robert resolved that none of it mattered. They would fight with what they had. Across the courtyard, Red Jacobs waved a flashlight from atop a damaged watchtower, signaling that he and Eagle Eye were in position. The time for final preparations was slipping away. Robert swallowed the knot in his throat. Heads up, everyone, he said into the comm, loud enough for all who were linked to hear. We're about to face a bigger, meaner fight. We stand our ground or we fall. Either way, we give these bastards everything we've got. Even as Robert finished speaking, a roar of multiple engines echoed across the desert. A line of headlights appeared on the horizon, like predatory eyes gleaming in the darkness, heralding the approach of the second wave. A pale moon hung low in the sky, half obscured by smoke drifting from the battered front yard of the detention facility. Out on the highway, 6 sets of headlights glowed like ominous beacons against the dusty air. Inside the command center, Sam and Breaker watched through grainy external camera feeds, hearts pounding with anticipation. Breaker adjusted his headset, scanning radio frequencies. They're not trying to hide, he muttered. It's like they're coming in loud, making a statement. Sam typed rapidly at a console. That fits the intel, they're confident. They know we're wounded from the first fight, and they assume we'll fold when they hit us with heavier weapons. Breaker exhaled slowly, pulling up the feed from the sublevel sensors. A few blinking lines of code filled the screen. We have partial motion sensor coverage in the tunnels. If they try sneaking in below, we might catch them. But these old systems are unreliable. Sam nodded. We'll keep an eye on it. Meanwhile, patch me into the loudspeakers. Maybe we can use them to direct our own people or mislead the enemy if needed. Breaker complied, and Sam leaned closer to the microphone. All units, outer perimeter, eyes on the highway. They're coming from the main road. I repeat, main road. Stay in cover. A Atop the perimeter fence, the battered ICE guard force braced for impact. Some used improvised sandbag positions, others crouched behind jersey barriers. The tension was suffocating. Each guard clenched a weapon, be it a standard-issue pistol, a shotgun, or the occasional rifle. They were outnumbered, but they had no choice but to stand firm. Robert and Mojo took positions behind a half-collapsed supply shed near the front gate, the same area they desperately defended just hours before. They crouched low, scanning the oncoming headlights. Mojo twisted his neck, trying to ease the stiffness from the forklift collision. "We got any shot at negotiating?" Robert didn't look away from the approaching vehicles. "They're not interested in negotiation. They lost a lieutenant and we still have their enforcer. This wave is about revenge and retrieval, but mostly revenge." Mojo nodded bitterly, gripping his rifle tighter. Several yards away, Red Jacobs and Eagle Eye hunkered down behind a scorched SUV. Red let out a low whistle. "That's a lot of headlights." Eagle Eye fiddled with the scope on the anti-material rifle, checking for damage. "We'll pick off as many as we can. But if they bring an armored vehicle like before, we're in trouble." Red forced a grin. "Then we do that forklift trick again?" Eagle Eye chuckled despite the fear. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that." Diego, bandaged and grim, slipped into a flank position behind a stack of shattered concrete blocks. He'd brought along 2 IC guards who looked rattled but resolute. "Aim small, miss small," Diego reminded them quietly. "Short, controlled bursts if you have automatics. Don't go spraying like amateurs." The guards nodded, sweat beading on their brows. One clutched a battered M4 carbine, the other a shotgun with a bandolier of slugs. They were no Delta Force, but they were ready to fight for their lives. At last, the convoy slowed to a halt on the desert highway about 100 yards from the facility gates. Engines rumbled, headlights illuminating the battered chain link and the scorch marks from the previous fight. A brief hush fell. Then doors swung open and shapes emerged, silhouettes of heavily armed fighters spreading out in formation. They didn't bother with stealth or subtlety. This was a show of force. An amplified voice echoed across the desert night, speaking Spanish with a harsh northern accent. "Ustedes van a morir. Entregan a Raúl Martínez o derabarimos to do este lugar." "You will all die. Hand over Raúl Martínez or we will bring this entire place down." Robert exchanged glances with Mojo. They both understood enough Spanish to catch the menace. The cartel wanted El Zurdo, and they were willing to reduce the entire facility to rubble if necessary. Robert keyed his calm. "They're demanding we hand over El Zurdo." Sam's voice crackled back. "Well, that's not happening. We have orders from above to hold him for federal custody. But I'm guessing that's not the answer they want." Robert let out a slow breath. "Indeed." He switched channels to address all defenders. "Hold your fire until they make a move. Let them get close enough that we can pick our shots. Eagle Eye, if you see a high-value target, take it." Levi's tense reply came. "Copy." The standoff stretched, each side assessing the other. Dust swirled beneath the stark glare of headlights, turning the scene into a surreal battlefield painting. The man with the loudspeaker spoke again, repeating the demand. When no answer came, a single bullet whined over the chain-link fence, skipping off the pavement near the main gate. Mojo hissed under his breath. "They're probing us." Robert's pulse hammered. He didn't want to initiate a firefight that would lead to an even worse bloodbath. But he also couldn't negotiate with a cartel that had committed mass violence on U.S. soil. A flicker of movement caught his eye. One of the silhouettes hefted what looked like a rocket launcher. He reacted instantly. "RPG inbound. Take him out." 3 rifles barked in near unison. Mojo's, Diego's, and a guard's. The rocket launcher wielder stumbled, dropping to his knees, then fell forward. The weapon clattered away unfired. That was the spark. In a blink, the night erupted in muzzle flashes. The cartel fighters opened up with everything they had: automatic rifles, high-caliber machine guns, even grenades that flared through the darkness. The defenders returned fire from behind their meager cover, muzzle flashes lighting their faces in harsh staccato. Bullets shredded chain link, sparks dancing along the fences. One IC guard cried out, clutching his leg as he went down behind a barrier. Another guard rushed to drag him clear, ignoring the furious hail of lead overhead. From the rooftop, Eagle Eye picked off a cartel gunner who had managed to crouch behind the bed of a truck, aiming a heavy machine gun at the watchtower. The man's body slumped, but two more quickly took his place, dragging the machine gun to a new position. Near the main gate, Robert and Mojo huddled behind the supply shed, taking turns popping up to fire. The air thundered, each breath tasting of copper and ash. Robert spotted a cartel fighter edging forward with a satchel of explosives. He leaned out, squeezed the trigger, and dropped him at 30 yards. Another advanced from the left, using covering fire from his comrades, but Red Jacob's rifle barked twice, sending him sprawling in the dust. Despite the defender's skill, the sheer volume of cartel gunfire was overwhelming. The chain link sagged under the onslaught, and the makeshift barricades began to buckle. Several IC guards cowered behind barriers, exchanging glances filled with dread. Abruptly, a new type of weapon lit the sky, a mortar-like arc trailing sparks. It impacted the courtyard with a dull whump, sending a pressure wave that shattered nearby windows. Dirt and debris rained down. Another projectile followed, exploding closer to the facility's outer wall. Bits of concrete pelted the defenders like shrapnel. Mojo's eyes widened. They're lobbing grenades or some improvised mortar shells. Robert dove for better cover as another shell struck. A chunk of cinder block slammed into the side of the supply shed, narrowly missing him. "We've got to neutralize that launcher." The problem was that the launcher was set far behind the front line, likely near one of the vehicles still on the highway. They had no clear sight line. Over the comm, Eagle Eye's voice crackled. "I'm trying to spot the mortar, but they're firing from behind a truck or off to the side. No visual yet." Another shell arced overhead, this time landing near the guard booth remains. A plume of dust billowed upward, lit by muzzle flashes. The defenders coughed, momentarily blinded. "Push up, or they'll pound us to bits," Robert yelled. "Mojo, Red with me. Diego, hold the flank here. Eagle Eye, keep trying for that launcher if you see it." Amid the chaos, the three X-Delta men sprinted from cover to cover, using the smoke from blasts to mask their advance. Bullets clipped the edges of dumpsters and barriers, zinging off metal. They reached a shallow ditch near the fence line. Beyond it, the incoming fire was heavier than anything they had seen so far. Crouched in the ditch, panting, Robert raised his rifle and peered through a gap in the fence. He spotted the muzzle flash of an automatic rifle on the other side, aimed directly at their section of the compound. He and Mojo unleashed coordinated shots. Red lobbed a tear gas canister through the gap, hoping to sow confusion among the closest cartel fighters. The canister spewed a cloud of noxious gas, prompting muffled shouts in Spanish and frantic scrambling to don masks. But that mortar launcher hammered again. Thump, whump, and a fresh explosion rocked the courtyard, forcing the defenders near the gate to scatter. As Robert, Mojo, and Red prepared to cut through the fence for a daring flank attack on the mortar team, a crackle in Robert's earpiece brought Sam's urgent whisper. "Boss, we've got movement in the sub-level tunnels. Sensors are lighting up. Multiple hostiles down there." Robert froze in mid-motion, wire cutters in hand, when Sam's urgent whisper crackled through his earpiece. "Boss, we've got movement in the sub-level tunnels. Sensors are lighting up. Multiple hostiles down there." Adrenaline jolted him. The plan to flank the mortar team suddenly seemed less critical compared to the threat of a hidden infiltration. He pressed a hand to his earpiece, signaling Red and Mojo to hold. Sam, confirm how many? Sam's voice was grim. 4 or 5, maybe more. Some sensors are shot, so we can't get an exact read. But they're advancing quickly. Mojo met Robert's gaze, reading the situation instantly. The mortar on the highway was terrifying, but a successful infiltration from below could be catastrophic, especially if the cartel made it into critical areas like the control room or the detainee blocks. They might even blow the foundation. Split forces, Red asked breathlessly. Or handle the tunnels first? Robert's brain spun with tactical calculations. The mortar bombardment was pounding their perimeter, already sowing chaos among the defenders. But the sub-level infiltration was an existential threat. If the cartel planted explosives beneath them or attacked from inside, the facility would be undone. He tapped his comm again, voice tight. Sam, patch me to Eagle Eye. Eagle Eye. Do you have any visual on that mortar team? Eagle Eye responded, gunfire rattling in the background. Not yet. They're hiding behind one of the big trucks. I keep seeing muzzle flashes, but no clear line of sight. Robert realized they were stuck. Okay, stay on them. I'm redirecting to the tunnels. Red, Mojo, decide who leads the flank. Red instantly volunteered. I'll flank the mortar with 2 ICE guards. Mojo, you go with the boss to the tunnels. Mojo gave a quick nod. The 2 men grasped each other's forearms in a show of mutual respect. Robert squeezed Red's shoulder. Don't get yourself killed. A wry grin twitched at Red's lips. I'll try not to. He signaled for the ICE guards to follow and then slipped off into the swirling dust, hugging the perimeter, seeking a path that might let them surprise the mortar crew. Robert gestured for Mojo to follow him back toward the facility interior. Bullets snapped the air around them as they darted from crater to crater, half running, half crawling. When they finally reached a shattered side entrance to the main building, 2 wide-eyed ICE guards on post nearly jumped at the sudden arrival. Hallways are still under heavy guard, one guard stammered. But the sub-level? We're not sure. Robert nodded. Mojo and I will handle it. Keep your eyes up top. If you see anything suspicious, radio Sam immediately. They hustled down a stairwell that descended 1 level to the facility's mechanical substructure. The contrast between the raging battle outside and the echoing hush below was eerie. Footsteps clattered, and overhead pipes hummed with water or power lines. Dim emergency lights flickered at intervals, painting the corridor in washes of red. Gunshots and explosions up above were muted here, like thunder heard through a thick wall. Mojo checked his rifle, inhaling sharply. Where do we start looking? Robert pointed to an old schematic taped to the wall. These tunnels run beneath blocks B, C, and D, with a narrower utility line going under the yard. Sam said the sensors triggered near the D-block corridor, where they tried to free El Zerto. They headed toward a heavy metal door labeled Sublevel Access D3. It was locked with a numeric keypad. Robert punched in the master code. The door clicked. They braced themselves, weapons raised. The hallway beyond was more claustrophobic. Rusting pipes lined the walls, and the stale air smelled of dust and old lubricant. Flickering fluorescent tubes overhead cast jittery shadows. At first, it seemed deserted. Mojo whispered, "Could be a false sensor reading." Robert shook his head. "Doubt it." They advanced slowly, passing junction boxes and an emergency generator that hummed with residual power. Halfway down the corridor, the overhead lights dimmed again, replaced by a flickering red glow. Mojo cursed under his breath. The jamming device might be interfering with facility power lines now, or the cartel had sabotaged a panel. Behind them, a faint scrape echoed, a footstep on concrete. Robert and Mojo spun, weapons raised. A muzzle flash erupted from behind a row of metal storage cabinets. Bullets pinged off the walls. Robert and Mojo dove behind a piping conduit, returning fire. In the strobe-like flicker of muzzle blasts, they glimpsed 3 cartel fighters crouched behind the cabinets. One of them hurled a small device. Mojo recognized it instantly. "Grenade!" he hissed. They scrambled further down the hallway, flinging themselves prone as the explosion rocked the sublevel. A pressure wave slammed them against the floor, dust billowing in a thick cloud. Coughing, Robert rolled to his knees. He groped for his rifle, vision blurred by smoke. "Mojo?" he croaked. "Here," came the reply. Mojo's silhouette emerged from the haze, battered but intact. Gunfire resumed. One of the cartel fighters advanced, muzzle flashing. Sparks flew off a nearby valve. Robert steadied his rifle, fired a controlled burst. The assailant jerked, collapsing in a heap. The other 2 dove back into the next corridor, evidently retreating deeper into the tunnels. Mojo rubbed grit from his face. They're heading for the foundation level, probably trying to plant charges or loop around to the cell blocks. Robert set his jaw. "We stop them now." They pressed forward, ignoring the ringing in their ears. The corridor branched into a T-shape. Faint footsteps and murmured Spanish echoed from the left. Robert signaled, and they crept in that direction. A faint, rhythmic beeping reached their ears, like a timer or a digital countdown. Mojo's pulse spiked. "They've planted bombs." Just around the corner, they spotted the last 2 cartel fighters feverishly attaching what looked like C4 charges to a thick support pillar. Wires snaked from the explosives to a digital timer that blinked ominously. The men wore black tactical vests and night vision goggles, acting with calm efficiency, professionals. Robert made a silent hand signal to Mojo. "I take left, you take right." They burst into the open, rifles barking. Both cartel men spun to engage, but one took a bullet to the chest, the other to the neck. They crumpled, weapons clattering on concrete. Robert and Mojo rushed forward, hearts pounding at the sight of the blinking timer. 15 seconds left, Mojo spat. No time to guess the code. Robert knelt, forcing his breathing steady. The device was improvised but sophisticated. He recognized a standard spool of wire leading to a blasting cap. Without the right disarm sequence, any wire cut might trigger detonation. He'd done EOD work in Delta, but never liked it. "Cover me," Robert said. Mojo took up a defensive position, scanning for more hostiles. Robert plucked out a multi-tool from his belt, cursing the meager light. His fingers found the correct lead connected to the trigger circuit. "Come on." 10 seconds. 9. He cut the wire. The device beeped erratically, then went silent. Heart in his throat, Robert held it, waiting, half expecting an explosion. None came. Exhaling relief, he removed the blasting cap from the lump of C4. Bomb defused. Let's see if they planted more. They searched the immediate area. No additional charges. But the near disaster underscored how close the facility had been to collapse. With a single explosion under the D-block support pillar, the entire wing could have crumbled. As they regrouped, Robert tapped his earpiece, half surprised it still functioned. "Sam, this is Robert. We neutralized a bomb team in the sublevel. One device disarmed, but we don't know if there are more. Give me an update on the second wave up top." Sam's response was garbled by static but mostly intelligible. "Under mortar fire, Red's trying to flank. We're taking heavy casualties, but we're holding. The west fence is compromised. Diego's plugging the gap with a small team. Hurry up if you can." Robert closed his eyes briefly. The battle above was reaching a fever pitch, and the defenders were spread dangerously thin. "We'll do a quick sweep for more bombs, then head up," Mojo agreed. Together, they double-checked the corridor. One of the dead cartel men had a half-filled satchel. Inside it were additional lumps of explosive plus remote triggers. They confiscated everything, effectively disarming the infiltration threat. Confident no other major bombs were hidden in this section, they finally turned to head upstairs. Just as they approached the stairwell door, an explosion rocked the facility from above. The overhead pipes rattled violently, dust and debris cascading from the ceiling. Over the comm, Sam's voice crackled with dread. "They've overrun the west side. Diego's pinned down. We might lose the entire perimeter." Diego Alvarez crouched behind a half-collapsed section of fence, panting, heart pounding against his ribcage. Two terrified IC guards huddled beside him, eyes wide. The west side of the detention facility, once thought the quieter flank, was now a war zone unto itself. After the mortar shells had slammed into the courtyard, the cartel's second wave advanced in a sweeping maneuver, pouring rifle fire into the western fence line. A newly arrived pickup truck with improvised steel plates barreled through the perimeter, scattering defenders. Diego and a handful of ICE guards had scrambled to hold the breach. Now muzzle flashes lit the night. Thick smoke billowed from a half-torn fence post that caught fire when a Molotov cocktail impacted. The flickering orange glow revealed at least 5 cartel gunmen crouched behind the stolen pickup, exchanging bursts of automatic fire with Diego and his men. One IC guard whimpered, nursing a bleeding arm. "We can't hold this, sir. There's too many." Diego gritted his teeth. "We hold," he growled, firing a short burst that forced a cartel gunman back into cover. "They can't break through to the cell blocks. We lose that. Everyone inside is vulnerable." A meaty thump from behind alerted him to something else. Diego glanced over his shoulder, cursing under his breath. More cartel reinforcements were coming from a side alley next to the facility's loading dock. He quickly radioed, though the static was intense. "Breaker, do you read? We need backup on the west side. Hostiles flanking." Only faint static greeted him. The jamming was still in play. Another IC guard tried her comm, no luck. They were on their own just like earlier in D-Block. The pickup's engine roared. The driver slammed the gas, fishtailing through the gap in the fence. The metal beast rattled over debris, heading straight for the half-collapsed perimeter wall. Diego realized they meant to create an even wider path for the rest of the cartel gunmen. "Take out that truck," he shouted to his team. One guard fired a shotgun slug, shattering the windshield but failing to stop the vehicle. Another guard opened up with an AR-15, peppering the engine block. Smoke gushed out, yet the truck still lurched forward. Diego took a gamble. He sprinted from cover, ignoring the bullets whizzing around him, and hurled a fragmentation grenade into the truck's open passenger window. He dove to the ground, shielding his head. A split second later, the truck's cab erupted in a fiery blast, hurling a twisted metal door into the air. The machine squealed to a halt, flames licking from its interior. Smoke and the stench of fuel filled Diego's nostrils. He coughed, rolling to a knee, scanning for surviving threats. A figure staggered out of the driver's side, clothes aflame, screaming. Another cartel fighter tried to drag him back, but an ICE guard opened fire, ending both men's misery. The rest of the cartel fighters around the truck recoiled in shock, momentarily disorganized. "Now!" Diego shouted. "Advance!" The ICE guards, hearts pounding with renewed adrenaline, rose from behind the fence. They unleashed a withering fusillade at the scattered attackers. 2 more cartel men went down, thrashing in the dirt. The others stumbled back behind a retaining wall, returning sporadic fire. Felt like a small victory, but the west side was still compromised, and Diego saw new shadows moving in the distance. More men, more vehicles. They would keep coming, wave upon wave, until the defenders broke. A voice yelled from behind, "Diego! Over here!" He spun to see Red Jacobs, covered in dust and sweat, emerging from behind a smoldering forklift. 2 ICE guards followed, each cradling rifles with haunted eyes. "We took out the mortar crew," Red said breathlessly. "But more are heading this way. They're like locusts." Diego exhaled relief. "We just neutralized that truck. But we can't hold if more keep flooding in." Red surveyed the burning wreckage, the battered defenders, the row of bullet-riddled fence. "We'll set up a crossfire with your men. I saw a vantage point behind those crates near the loading dock. We can mow them down if they try to push further." Diego gave a firm nod. "Let's do it." They organized a quick plan. Red took 2 guards to the crates for a flanking angle, while Diego led the others in a frontal defense behind the remains of the fence. The tension was suffocating, like the hush before an avalanche. Distant shouts in Spanish echoed across the yard, the cartel regrouping for another push. "This is insane," murmured one IC guard, trembling. We're just a detention center. We're not supposed to be in a war." Diego understood the man's terror, but he forced a steady tone. "Look at me. You hold your ground, or these killers will slaughter everyone inside. We've come too far to quit now." A ragged exhale. Then the guard nodded, swallowing his fear. Moments later, muzzle flashes bloomed again, and the night exploded with lethal violence. Cartel enforcers emerged from cover, spraying bullets. Some lobbed crude grenades that rattled the yard, flinging dirt skyward. Diego and his team answered with disciplined gunfire, aiming low, picking their shots. Red's group laid down a harsh volley from the crates, catching the attackers in a brutal crossfire. Still, the cartel advanced, stepping over the bodies of their own dead. One fighter launched a rocket-propelled grenade that soared overhead, exploding against a facility wall. The concussion nearly threw Diego off his feet. Dazed, he blinked away stars. The guard beside him took a ricochet to the leg, howling in pain. "Fall back," Red shouted through the commotion. "The corner of the building, go!" Reluctantly, Diego signaled a withdrawal. They were outgunned. With difficulty, they dragged the wounded guard and retreated toward the building corner, seeking sturdier cover behind thick concrete. The bullets whizzing by felt endless, a hornet swarm of hot metal. As they reached the corner, another explosion erupted near the fence, raining shrapnel. Diego glimpsed at least a dozen cartel fighters streaming into the yard, howling war cries. Everything was chaos, smoke, and muzzle flashes. Just as Diego and Red's battered group slammed their backs against the concrete wall, preparing for a last stand, a familiar voice roared from behind, "Get down!" It was Robert, emerging with Mojo from a side stairwell, having finally returned from the sublevel, new weapons in hand, ready to turn the tide. Robert and Mojo burst onto the battlefield at the west corner of the detention facility, fresh from defusing bombs in the sublevel. With them came 2 IC officers pushing a supply cart laden with riot control gear and scavenged ammunition. The sight was a jolt of hope for Diego and Red, pinned down by a superior cartel force. "We thought you were still down there," Diego shouted over the din. Robert squeezed Diego's uninjured shoulder. "Handled the bombs. No time to talk. We've got a plan." Mojo tore open the cart's cache. Flashbangs, tear gas, a handful of breaching charges. "Grab what you can use." The approaching wave of cartel fighters fanned out, muzzle flashes stuttering in the half-darkness. Bullets peppered the concrete walls and ricocheted off steel piping. Robert noted at least a dozen immediate threats, with more lurking beyond. Enough to overwhelm them, if not for cunning and timing. He pointed to a dilapidated forklift near the yard's perimeter. "We'll funnel them into that choke point," he yelled. "Diego, Red, take half the guards, flank left. Mojo and I will hit them with tear gas from the right. Once they're disoriented, we close in." Red flashed a thumbs up. "Understood." Diego swapped his near-empty magazine for a fresh one. Despite the fatigue etched in every line of his face, his eyes held fierce determination. He and Red led a group of guards to the left side of the yard, crouching behind crates and twisted fence sections. Mojo handed out tear gas grenades to the right flank defenders. Robert double-checked the device in his hand, a single stun grenade he'd saved for a critical moment. The plan hinged on controlling the chaos. They had to break the cartel's momentum. Already, the gunmen advanced in leaps and bounds, covering each other with suppressive fire. Another improvised rocket whooshed overhead, exploding against the building. Rubble and dust rained down. Robert called out, "Now!" and lobbed the first tear gas canister. Mojo and 3 ICE guards followed suit, arching grenades into the enemy formation. They hissed, spewing thick plumes of acrid smoke. The cartel fighters recoiled, coughing and cursing. Seizing the moment, Red and Diego's group rose from cover, unleashing a concentrated volley. Figures stumbled in the swirling gas, some firing wildly, others retreating. Then Robert hurled the stun grenade, which detonated with a blinding flash. A split-second hush followed before both flanks hammered the staggered cartel with disciplined gunfire. The effect was devastating. At least 6 attackers dropped, writhing on the ground. The rest scrambled back, choking and clutching streaming eyes. One tried to lob a grenade but fumbled in the confusion, and it exploded among his own companions. Amid the mayhem, an ICE guard near Robert let out a triumphant whoop. "We're pushing them back." Robert, however, knew it wasn't over. "Keep the pressure on. Don't let them regroup." Together, the defenders advanced in a wedge formation. Robert and Mojo on one side, Diego and Red on the other, ICE guards interspersed between them. Every shot was purposeful. They had drilled such tactics countless times in Delta Force, cutting a path through chaos with ruthless precision. Bit by bit, the cartel retreated, leaving behind dead or wounded. The noxious tear gas hung in the air, illuminated by muzzle flashes. A few determined holdouts returned fire. Robert felt a bullet zip past his cheek, close enough to burn. He fired back, neutralizing the shooter. Finally, the last few gunmen turned tail, sprinting out through the battered fence. Engines roared to life somewhere in the darkness. The cartel had a few vehicles left. As Robert's group emerged from the gas, they saw headlights speeding away, a handful of silhouettes leaping onto truck beds, cursing in Spanish. Mojo panted, leaning on a chunk of concrete. They're pulling back." Diego shook his head warily. Could be a trap, but no further gunshots came. Instead, the wail of sirens began in the distance. Police cruisers or border patrol finally mobilized to the outskirts of Rio Seco. The cartel, battered and losing men, must have decided the risk outweighed the reward. Red Jacobs surveyed the yard, rifle in hand. "We actually pushed them out." Robert allowed himself a brief moment to breathe. "Check your corners. It might be partial retreat." Slowly, the defenders swept the yard, rounding up wounded cartel fighters who hadn't escaped. More ICE guards emerged from the building, drawn by the lull in gunfire. The entire facility reeked of spent munitions, tear gas, and the metallic tang of blood. After what felt like an eternity, the radio crackled with Breaker's voice. "Local LEOs are inbound in force, boss. They say 10 minutes, tops. Seems the cartel is retreating southward." Robert sank to one knee, exhaustion washing over him. He pressed the transmit button. "Copy that. We're securing the perimeter." Thank God. As the team began the grim task of clearing bodies and tending to the wounded, an urgent call came through from Sam. "Robert, we've got movement on the internal cameras. Someone's in the cell block. Not cartel. Another detainee group has forced the lock. They're trying to riot and break out." The news of an internal riot threat felt like a gut punch. Robert had assumed the detainees, though terrified, would mostly hunker down. But Sam's call changed everything. Even with the cartel retreating, the situation inside was now at risk of boiling over. Groans of the wounded and the crackle of smoldering fires surrounded Robert, but he forced himself up. "Mojo, Diego, come with me." He scanned the battered ICE guards. "Red, coordinate with Breaker and Eagle Eye to secure the perimeter. I'll handle the riot situation." "Roger that," Red said, though he looked concerned about Robert's haggard state. "Be careful in there." Robert mustered a faint smile. "You know me." He, Mojo, and Diego jogged across the yard, weaving between bullet-riddled vehicles and lumps of twisted metal. The building's main entrance was a war-scarred husk. Shattered glass, buckled frames, but the emergency backup door near the corridor was still intact. Once inside, they found the interior cloaked in half-darkness, red emergency lights buzzing overhead. Sam's voice crackled over the facility PA. "Attention staff. The riot is contained to cell block C, near the cafeteria. All available personnel converge there immediately." A wave of dread tightened Robert's chest. Cell block C is near the low-security detainees. Might be petty criminals, but if they've armed themselves somehow, that's a problem. Diego gripped his sidearm. In the confusion, anyone could have gotten hold of weapons. We had to stash rifles in different spots. They navigated dim corridors, passing wide-eyed support staff and paramedics tending to wounded guards. Detainees along the quieter blocks pressed their faces to reinforced windows, some calling out or banging on the glass in fear or frustration. Rounding a corner, they saw the door to cell block C had been forced open. 2 ICE officers lay on the floor, one unconscious, one moaning with a head wound. Robert paused to check pulses. Both alive but badly beaten. Mojo clenched his jaw. They used the chaos to jump these guards. A thunderous roar of voices echoed from down the corridor. Clashing metal, furious shouting in Spanish and English, the crash of something heavy slamming into a barricade. Robert signaled for caution, and they advanced, checking each side door in case detainees were lurking. At the threshold to the cell block, they spotted a scene of near mayhem. A group of detainees had toppled tables, pried open a small weapons locker, and were brandishing batons, makeshift clubs, even a confiscated shotgun that must have been stored there. The corridor stank of overturned garbage bins and spilled food. Another handful of detainees battered at a reinforced door leading deeper into the facility, presumably aiming for an exit route or a stash of keys. One detainee, a wiry man with face tattoos, noticed Robert's group. He shouted to his cohorts, "They're here! Get them before they call more guards." Instantly, 6 or 7 detainees rushed forward, brandishing weapons. Robert, Diego, and Mojo raised their firearms. "Stop!" Robert bellowed. "Back up or we will fire." The detainees hesitated for a fraction of a second, but then roared in defiance, spurred by mob mentality. The man with the shotgun pointed it wildly at the trio. Mojo reacted instantly with a single precise shot to the man's shoulder. The shotgun blast went wide, pellets harmlessly peppering the ceiling. The man collapsed, screaming. Panic momentarily broke the detainees' charge, but they were riled up. One heaved a metal chair at Diego. Diego dodged, taking aim at the man's leg. Another detainee lunged at Robert with a stolen baton. Robert sidestepped and delivered a swift strike with his rifle, but dropping him to the ground. All around, detainees yelled, some scattering, others pressing the attack. The corridor turned into a brawl of desperate men. A detainee cracked a baton over Mojo's arm, making him snarl in pain. He retaliated with an elbow strike, sending the assailant sprawling. At the far end of the corridor, a ringleader in a dirty white t-shirt hollered, "Keep fighting, hermanos. We can escape." He grabbed a set of keys from an unconscious guard, fumbling to unlock another door. Seeing that the ringleader could free an entire row of cells, Robert yelled to Diego, "Cover me!" then sprinted down the hall. Diego fired warning shots over the heads of detainees, forcing them to scatter or duck. Robert charged the ringleader, tackling him just as he got the key into the door lock. They slammed against the wall, and the ring of keys fell from his grip. The ringleader snarled, struggling viciously. He landed a punch to Robert's ribs, but Robert's adrenaline surged. He slammed the man's wrist against the concrete, dislodging a small shiv. A twist of Robert's hips pinned the ringleader face down. "Enough!" Robert roared. By now, the initial fury of the detainees was losing steam. Most realized the three armed operators had the upper hand. Mojo, though nursing a bruise, had subdued two more detainees with well-placed strikes. Diego disarmed another who was wielding a broken-off table leg. Panting, Robert yanked the ringleader upright. The man spat, "They treat us like animals. We." A single, heavy-lidded stare from Robert cut him off. "Your riot just got your friends hurt. Stand down." The ringleader's gaze flickered with defiance, but the fight had gone out of him. He saw detainees moaning on the floor, the confiscated shotgun lying nearby, and the unyielding posture of three men who had fought far worse battles than a cell block riot. Within minutes, the detainees who had participated in the riot were forcibly corralled into a central holding area. Additional guards arrived, some battered, all furious, and resecured the block. Sam Tien rushed in, breathless, relief flooding his features at the sight of Robert, Diego, and Mojo alive. Sam glanced around at the subdued detainees and the scattered wreckage. "How bad?" Diego pressed an ice pack to a fresh bruise on his temple. "Could have been worse. They got bold, but we shut it down." Robert wiped sweat from his brow, scanning the corridor for anything amiss. "We're stable in here. How's the perimeter?" Sam's face lit with a trace of hope. "Local PD has arrived. The cartel's second wave is in retreat, plus we have a few ambulances pulling in. The yard is messy, but it's not a war zone anymore." Robert nodded, exhaustion sagging his shoulders. Then his comm buzzed, Breaker's urgent voice. "Robert, we have a radio intercept. The Santa Rosa cartel boss is on the line, threatening an air assault if we don't release El Zurdo. He's got a chopper fueling south of the border." Robert stood in the half-ruined corridor of Cell Block C, the acrid smell of tear gas and burnt plastic still lingering in the air. Breaker's words echoed in his head. "They're threatening an air assault. After everything, a two-wave ground assault, infiltration attempts, bombs in the sublevel, a detainee riot. Now the cartel wanted to escalate to a helicopter strike." His earpiece crackled again with Breaker's voice. "Robert, local law enforcement is on site, but they don't have anti-air capabilities. They say National Guard might take hours to scramble." Mojo let out a mirthless laugh. "Of course. Why not add a helicopter to the mix?" Diego looked pale, still pressing a bandage to a cut on his forehead. "If they come in with an attack chopper or a smuggled gunship, they'll light us up from above." Robert glanced at Sam, who was flanked by two ICE officers. "We still have El Zurdo. That's their main objective, either to free him or kill him." Sam nodded grimly. "He's locked in a reinforced cell in the deepest part of D Block. Hard to imagine a quick aerial extraction unless they have the gear to blow through the roof." Robert mulled the possibility. The cartel might just bomb the facility from the sky, punishing them for resisting, or attempt a rapid insertion on the roof. And given the carnage the cartel had already inflicted, it was no idle threat. He keyed his comm, "Breaker, Eagle Eye, where are you?" Breaker responded, "Control room, trying to patch into the cartel's transmissions. They're using a rotating encryption, but I'm catching bits." Eagle Eye is on the roof, scanning with binoculars. Robert paused. "Eagle Eye, anything?" Eagle Eye's voice came through, winded. "Not yet. Clear skies for miles. But if they're fueling up near the border, they might arrive within an hour. Robert turned to his team. We need a plan to neutralize that threat if it materializes. Worst case, we hold out for the National Guard to get here. But that could be too late. Sam looked uneasy. We can't exactly shoot a helicopter out of the sky with what we have. Mojo's eyes narrowed. We do have the anti-material rifle, and we've got some leftover gear from the cartel's own supply. RPGs, if any were left unfired. Diego snapped his fingers. El Tiburon's men brought rocket launchers. One misfired, but they must have had more. We might salvage a workable RPG from the dead or wounded attackers. Robert grimaced. That's risky, but if they really do come at us from the air, an RPG might be our only shot. Within minutes, the team was on the move. Robert tasked Sam with ensuring El Zurdo stayed locked down and guarded by the most reliable ICE officers. Meanwhile, Robert, Mojo, Diego, and a few others scoured the battlefield wreckage outside for any leftover rocket launchers. The yard now resembled a post-apocalyptic junkyard. Burned-out vehicles, cratered earth, bodies of cartel fighters being zipped into bags by local authorities. Under the glare of portable floodlights brought by the police, they found 2 partial RPG units amid the carnage. One with a cracked tube, the other missing its warhead. But after a tense search, Diego unearthed a second rocket-propelled grenade, still intact, in the trunk of a cartel SUV. He held it up triumphantly. We have 1 rocket. Mojo tested the launcher. Feels functional. He looked at Robert. 1 shot. Let's hope it counts. Robert nodded, eyes scanning the perimeter where a dozen uniformed police stood watch. Ambulances and a fire truck maneuvered, sirens flashing. A few news vans hovered at a distance, fueling the chaos with camera lenses. The chaotic scene reminded Robert of a distant memory. Some scorched village in Afghanistan. Press on the outskirts. Men with cameras capturing heartbreak and horror. He shook the thought away. Mojo, you and Eagle Eye coordinate. If a helicopter arrives, you two are our best chance of bringing it down. The rest of us will keep an eye on ground threats. At that, a short, burly police lieutenant approached, tipping his brim. Heard rumors about a chopper. We can't confirm. Robert nodded curtly. We're preparing for the worst. The lieutenant frowned. Are you sure we can't just hand over the detainee? Save more bloodshed. All eyes turned to Robert, who set his jaw. We don't negotiate with terrorists. This cartel has killed law enforcement and civilians. If they get El Zurdo back, it'll only embolden them. We stand. The policeman swallowed, then offered a resigned nod. Understood. Time slowed to a crawl. Robert felt both exhaustion and hyper-awareness. The hours of violence weighed on him like an iron cloak. He made sure the wounded were cared for, the perimeter was triple-checked, and the roof fully manned by Eagle Eye and Mojo with their single RPG. 30 minutes passed, then 40. The adrenaline began to ebb, replaced by an uneasy tension. Was the helicopter threat a bluff? Suddenly, a radio call from Eagle Eye shattered the quiet. Boss, I see an aircraft on the horizon. Low altitude, no lights. Coming in from the south. Robert's stomach twisted. He turned to the policeman. Get your people under cover. Now. Chaos erupted as officers scrambled behind vehicles or inside the facility. Sam broadcast a facility-wide alert. All staff, brace for possible aerial assault. Repeat, brace for aerial assault. Detainees in cells wailed or shouted, while the overhead PA droned warnings. Robert sprinted to the roof access stairs, ignoring his screaming muscles. By the time he emerged onto the rooftop, he could see a dark silhouette against the starry sky, a helicopter hugging low to the desert floor. Its engine noise was barely audible over the distant sirens. Mojo was already in position on one side of the roof, RPG perched on his shoulder. Eagle Eye stood beside him, scanning through night vision binoculars. Looks like a light helicopter, maybe an old civilian bird, Eagle Eye said. Could be rigged with weapons. Mojo hissed. They're definitely not here for sightseeing. Robert dropped to one knee. We only have one rocket, so we wait for them to commit. If they land or hover, that's your shot. The helicopter drew closer, black shape outlined by faint moonlight. Suddenly, it banked, revealing a door on the side. A muzzle flash flickered. Someone inside the chopper was firing a mounted weapon. Tracers streaked toward the facility roof. Robert and Eagle Eye dove flat as bullets whipped overhead, ricocheting off the concrete ledge. Mojo grimaced, readjusting the launcher. I need a better angle. This thing's not exactly pinpoint accurate. A thunderous rattle of gunfire pummeled the rooftop. Tiles and chunks of mortar flew. Through the gloom, Robert glimpsed an open side door on the helicopter with two masked men. One behind what looked like a belt-fed machine gun. The other might have been prepping a grenade or rocket of his own. They're going to circle around, Eagle Eye yelled, pointing. They'll come from behind. Aim for the courtyard or the building's top floors. Robert crawled to the opposite side of the roof, scanning the perimeter. Down below, police and IC staff huddled behind cover. A few tried returning fire with rifles, but the chopper soared too high and too fast. They'll get braver if we don't respond, Robert shouted to Mojo. When they circle back, you take the shot no matter what. Mojo nodded, sweat beading on his brow. Copy. The helicopter swooped wide in a long arc, then angled back, skimming the desert. Robert's pulse hammered. This was it. Muzzle flashes lit the night again as the door gunner unleashed another burst at the building. With a roar, Mojo rose to one knee, aimed the RPG, and squeezed the trigger. A plume of smoke blasted from the launch tube. The rocket streaked upward in a bright, fiery arc. For half a second, it looked perfect on target. Then the helicopter juked slightly. The rocket slammed into the tail boom, erupting in a ball of flame. Robert's heart leapt. The chopper skewed violently, tail spinning, rotor whining. The door gunner tumbled out, arms flailing as he plummeted into the darkness. The pilot fought for control, but the damage was catastrophic. Flames engulfed the fuselage as the chopper spun, clipped a row of power lines, and plummeted behind a low ridge with a thunderous crash. A billowing fireball lit the horizon, followed by a rumbling explosion that made the rooftop tremble. Below, in the courtyard, battered defenders erupted in weary cheers. Robert let out a trembling breath, feeling a wave of relief wash over him. Mojo dropped the RPG launcher, sinking to one knee. Bullseye! Eagle Eye exhaled, setting aside his binoculars. That was one hell of a shot. Robert patted Mojo's shoulder. And it was our only shot. They paused, gazing at the distant flames where the helicopter crashed. Then the adrenaline ebbed. The facility was safe, finally, it seemed, for the moment. Just then, Sam's voice crackled in Robert's earpiece. We have a call on the main line. The sheriff says the Santa Rosa cartel boss wants to speak to you personally. He says if we don't release El Zurdo in 1 hour, he'll send more men, an entire army, right across the border. The last threat echoed in Robert's mind as he climbed back down from the roof, Mojo and Eagle Eye following close. His entire body ached. Dozens of small bruises and burns from the chaotic battle, but the fresh ultimatum renewed the tension. Inside the command center, Sam stood by a phone console, face pale. Breaker hovered over a laptop, coordinating with the local law enforcement still on scene. Police band chatter filled the background with frantic updates about the crashed helicopter and scattered cartel vehicles fleeing into the night. When Robert entered, Sam pressed a button on the console. I've got him on hold. Robert took a steadying breath. Put him through. A metallic click. Then a cold, gravelly voice spoke in heavily accented English. "So this is the infamous Robert Chandler, yes? The man who killed El Tiburon and destroyed my helicopter." Robert gripped the phone receiver. "I'm the head of security here. Who am I speaking to?" A dry chuckle. "Call me Romero. Santa Rosa owes you a debt of blood, Chandler. But we can settle this if you hand over Raul Martinez, El Zurdo, and that traitor Eduardo Vargas. You have 1 hour. Otherwise, my men come in force." Robert inhaled slowly. The cartel had lost an entire strike team, a second wave, an infiltrator cell, and even a helicopter. Yet they still had enough manpower to threaten an entire army. For a group as large as Santa Rosa, it might not be an idle threat. He glanced at Sam, who shook his head vigorously. "We don't hand over detainees. That was the unspoken rule." Robert cleared his throat. "We're under federal orders to keep El Zurdo in custody. There's no negotiation." Another dark laugh from the phone. "You prefer more bloodshed on American soil? Fine. I'll enjoy hearing how your precious facility crumbles." Robert's temper flared, but he forced composure. "Your men have already failed. You have heavy casualties. Another attempt will only bring more death, for both sides." "I have men to spare," Romero growled. "You do not." Silence weighed. Robert considered bluffing about air support or the National Guard. But the truth was that help might still be hours away, and the cartel could potentially send more foot soldiers across the border in minutes. The Santa Rosa network was vast. Finally, Robert spoke, voice cold. "If you come, you'll find us waiting, and we'll bury every one of your men." Romero snarled. "So be it. 1 hour, Chandler. After that, your facility is mine." Click, and the line went dead. Sam let out a tense breath. "He means it. We've got wounded staff, barely any ammunition left. We can't survive a third wave if they send an actual battalion." Breaker rubbed his temples. "Local cops are at their limit, too. The news outlets are already painting this as a war zone. They're pressuring the state government to intervene, but I'm not sure it'll be fast enough." Mojo leaned against a wall. "Maybe the best move is to relocate El Zurdo and Vargas. Get them out of the facility. If the cartel's entire focus is here, we vanish with the detainees. Then the facility stops being a target." Robert perked up at the idea. "You mean an off-the-books transport?" Mojo nodded. "We can arrange a small convoy, slip out the back roads. Santa Rosa is fixated on attacking this building. By the time they realize El Zurdo and Vargas are gone, we'd be halfway to a secure military base or a bigger federal lockup." Diego, who had just entered the control room, frowned. "We'll need transport that's not easily tracked. And we'd have to do it quietly, or the cartel might tail us." Sam paced. "We do have a few unmarked vans in the facility motor pool, used for quiet detainee moves. But the roads might be watched by cartel scouts. We'd need a decoy or some kind of diversion." Robert glanced at the countdown clock Sam had set. 54 minutes remained until Romero's supposed invasion. The battered facility had no chance of withstanding an all-out assault. The plan had merit, but it was fraught with risk. If the cartel realized the detainees they wanted were being moved, they could ambush them on the open road. Yet the alternative was a slaughter. "We do it," Robert decided. "Sam, coordinate a decoy convoy heading north, heavily guarded, looking like we're moving high-value detainees. Meanwhile, a smaller group, my old unit and a couple of guards, slips out a back route with El Zurdo and Vargas. We'll take them to Fort Calder or the nearest military installation." Sam nodded, eyes lighting with hope. "Fort Calder is about 60 miles east. If we take the old ranch roads, we might avoid contact." Breaker tapped on his laptop. "I'll feed false radio chatter about a big transport heading north. See if the cartel intercepts that. Meanwhile, you guys go east." Robert's gaze swept the room, lingering on each friend and ally. We can't bring all the staff. They need to remain to keep the ruse alive and maintain order. Just enough of us to protect the detainees from any stray cartel forces. It'll be dangerous, but staying here is worse. Mojo flexed his bruised arm. I'm with you. Diego nodded. Count me in. Sam locked eyes with Robert. We'll hold the fort, buy you time. Robert placed a hand on Sam's shoulder. Thanks, old friend. Keep this place intact. They had less than an hour to orchestrate the decoy convoy, prep the real transport, and slip El Zurdo and Vargas out under the cartel's nose. With the possibility of scouts all around, it felt like threading a needle in a hurricane. One misstep, and the entire plan would collapse into bloodshed once more. Long shadows draped the detention facility's back lot, where a high chain-link fence stood behind rows of weathered warehouses. Dim security lights buzzed overhead, providing just enough illumination to load the unmarked van without drawing attention. The hush was broken only by distant police chatter and the crackle of spotlights scanning the perimeter. Robert, Diego, Mojo, and two ICE guards, Reese and Conrad, were strapped with their personal weapons and a handful of flash grenades. They waited tensely by the vehicle as Sam brought the detainees. El Zurdo and Eduardo Vargas emerged, wrists shackled, guarded by two more officers. Both men bore fresh wounds. El Zurdo's bandaged arm, Vargas's bullet-grazed shoulder. Their faces were tight with anger and resignation. Even so, they carried an aura of lethal cunning. Robert knew better than to underestimate them. You drive, Robert instructed Diego, handing him the keys. We'll place Vargas and Zurdo in the back. Seats bolted to the floor. Reese and Conrad, you watch them. If either tries anything, you put them down. The guards nodded. Vargas sneered, wincing from his shoulder. You think we'll talk, gringo? We won't. El Zurdo spat. The boss will find you wherever you go. Robert ignored the taunts. He frisked each detainee once more, ensuring no hidden weapons. Then they were bundled into the van, metal cuffs secured to bolted rings on the floor. A partition separated them from the driver's seat. Sam appeared, breathless. Decoy convoy is rolling north in 5 minutes. Police units will escort it, make it look legit. Hopefully the cartel takes the bait. Robert gripped Sam's hand firmly. Give us as much time as you can. We'll radio if we make contact with the base. And, Sam, thank you. Sam managed a tight smile. Take care. Get these killers off our hands for good. With that, Robert, Mojo, and Diego climbed into the van. Reese and Conrad settled in back with the prisoners. The engine rumbled to life. They pulled away slowly, winding around the back fence. An ICE officer opened a rarely used maintenance gate. The chain squeaked, letting the van slip onto an old dirt road leading east. Moonlight bathed the desert terrain, and the van's headlights cut a thin path through swirling dust. Diego kept the speed moderate, not wanting to kick up a plume that might be spotted. For the first 15 minutes, tension strangled the air. Everyone listened for the drone of cartel vehicles or the whir of another helicopter. Inside the cramped back portion, Reese and Conrad hovered over El Zurdo and Vargas, guns ready. Robert occasionally glanced through the partition. He met Vargas's glare, stone-faced, letting the man see no hint of fear. Mojo pressed a phone to his ear. Breaker, any update? Over. Breaker's voice buzzed low. The decoy just left. Our watchers see no pursuit yet, but we can't be sure. Keep comm chatter minimal. Cartel might still jam or trace signals. They pressed on in silence, hugging the edges of rocky hills, the suspension jolting over ruts and washouts. At times, the van nearly bottomed out. Then the terrain would flatten, and they cruised more steadily. Mojo watched the mirror, brow furrowed. No sign of pursuit. Maybe the decoy worked. Robert rested his rifle across his lap. Let's not celebrate yet. Behind them, Vargas tested his shackles, rattling the metal. El Zurdo grimaced in discomfort, sweat beading on his brow. Suddenly, he spoke in Spanish, voice cold. "You'll never leave Texas alive, Chandler. Santa Rosa has informants everywhere." Robert didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he gave a curt order to Conrad. "Gag them if they keep talking. No need for speeches." El Zurdo bared his teeth but said nothing more. Time dragged on. 30 miles out, Diego turned onto an even narrower dirt path to avoid a known checkpoint near the highway. They weaved around arroyos and scrubland. Each crest of a hill revealed only more moonlit desert. Eventually, the distant glow of headlights appeared behind them, 2 sets, maybe half a mile back. Mojo stiffened. "We got company. Could be random travelers or could be a tail." Diego grimaced, pressing the accelerator. The van rumbled, dust trailing. The unknown vehicle sped up, still far but definitely following. Robert keyed his comm breaker. "We have potential pursuit. Any vehicles unaccounted for near our route?" Breaker's static-laced reply came. "We don't have eyes that far east. Could be civilians, but watch yourself." Robert turned to Mojo. "We can't outrun them in this terrain, not without risking a breakdown. If they close in, we set an ambush." Mojo nodded, checking his sidearm. "Better to pick the ground." El Zurdo smirked through the partition. "You can't hide from Santa Rosa." Robert ignored him. Diego scanned the map on his phone. "There's a dried creek bed up ahead with some rocky outcroppings. Could be a place to pull over and ambush if needed." Robert agreed. "Good. Let's do it." They continued another mile. The headlights behind them grew more distinct. Finally, Diego turned sharply off the main dirt path, guiding the van into a shallow ravine ringed by boulders and brush. He killed the lights, the engine ticking as it cooled. In the hush, they heard the rumble of engines drawing closer. "Positions," Robert ordered. He and Mojo hopped out, rifles ready. Reese and Conrad stayed in the back with the prisoners. Diego took cover behind a boulder, scanning the road with binoculars. Soon, the 2 sets of headlights appeared at the top of the ravine. The vehicles paused as if searching for a track. Robert steadied his breathing, finger on the trigger. If they were Cartel, the confrontation was imminent. One set of headlights veered right, continuing along the road. The other turned left, creeping toward the ravine. Slowly, it descended the slope. The faint glint of chrome suggested a large pickup truck. Robert's heart hammered. He had only one real advantage: surprise. The pickup advanced another 20 yards, headlights sweeping the dusty ground. Then a voice yelled out in Spanish, "Mancha de Huela's a key. Footprints here." Robert and Mojo exchanged grim nods. Cartel. They'd found the tracks from the van's tires. The pickup's doors opened, shadows piling out with weapons in hand. Robert held his breath, rifle sights lined up. A single spark could ignite another deadly firefight in this deserted ravine, with El Zurdo and Vargas shackled mere steps away. The next moments would decide everything: life, death, or escape. The desert night felt electrified with tension. Robert crouched behind a low boulder, peering through the scope of his rifle at the figures emerging from the pickup truck. He counted 4 men, each armed with assault rifles, scanning the ravine warily. One carried a handheld spotlight, sweeping it across the rocks. Mojo pressed against a rock a few paces away, gripping his own weapon. Diego was behind another boulder on the opposite flank, ready to crossfire if needed. In the van, Reese and Conrad waited nervously, weapons trained on the detainees to ensure they didn't escape if shooting began. A voice in Spanish echoed off the rocks. "No si vayan muy lejos. Busquen la camioneta. Don't go too far. Look for the van." They spread out in pairs, stepping cautiously, rifles raised. The beam of the spotlight flickered across Robert's position. He flattened himself, heart pounding, and the light slid away. A second later, a foot crunched gravel barely 5 yards behind him. One of the gunmen was dangerously close to flanking him. Robert mouthed to Mojo, "Take them or wait." Mojo signaled, "Wait." They needed the second pair to commit further, or else they'd risk alerting the entire group before maximizing the element of surprise. Sweat trickled down Robert's neck. Every muscle tensed. The gunman behind him took another step, scanning the boulders. The second pair, near the truck, peered into the darkness around the van's tracks. If they found the van itself hidden in the ravine, the shootout would be immediate. At last, the two near the truck turned, whispering in Spanish. One said, "They must be around here. Let's check behind those rocks." Mojo met Robert's eyes, nodding. Now, they launched their ambush. Mojo fired first, 2 suppressed shots dropping one truckside gunman before he could react. Robert spun, drilling the man behind him with a precise burst to the chest. The spotlight clattered onto the rocks, beam illuminating swirling dust. Diego opened fire from his flank, hitting the last gunman, who tried to return fire but stumbled backwards, riddled with bullets. The entire skirmish took less than 5 seconds. The air smelled of burnt powder and blood. Silence. No more footsteps or orders from the cartel. Robert signaled for caution, scanning the area. The second vehicle had continued on the main road, apparently not noticing the firefight. Mojo exhaled, shoulders slumping. All clear. Diego emerged from cover, rifle raised. They had no time to radio. "Looks like we got them all." Carefully, they approached the fallen gunmen, verifying none were alive or able to shoot. Robert retrieved the spotlight, flicking it off. The truck had its engine idling, headlights illuminating the ravine floor. Robert reached inside, yanked the keys and pocketed them. He rifled through a glove compartment, finding only spare ammo and a radio set to a dead channel. "They must have been scouting for us," he said. "Let's hope the other truck keeps going." Mojo wiped dust from his face. "We can't stay here. If that second vehicle is part of their group, they'll realize these guys are missing soon." Robert nodded. "Everybody back in the van. We keep moving east." They hurried to the van. Reese gave a thumbs up, indicating the detainees were still secured. El Zurdo glared, lips parted as though he might hurl an insult, but he remained silent. Vargas smoldered with silent fury. Diego fired up the engine, carefully maneuvering past the lifeless pickup. Robert felt a twinge of guilt for leaving bodies in the desert, but there was no time or capacity to handle them. This was survival. Resuming their course, they navigated by starlight and GPS, winding through back roads. Occasionally, a shape flitted across the beams, a coyote or jackrabbit, startled by the van's intrusion. The tension remained thick. Any moment, the cartel might reappear. An hour later, the sun's first hues glowed at the edge of the sky, turning blackness into a pale gray. Fort Calder was near, a cluster of lights on the horizon, behind a tall chain-link perimeter. Robert recognized it from old mission briefings. A small army installation with limited staff but secure infrastructure. As they approached, the road smoothed into asphalt. Soldiers at the entry checkpoint raised eyebrows at the battered van. Robert hopped out, hands raised, identifying himself as a retired Delta Force operator on a special assignment. He explained the emergency, showed official ICE documents, and demanded to speak with the commanding officer. Though wary, the soldiers recognized the urgency and called their CO. Within minutes, an army captain arrived in a jeep, eyes flicking suspiciously between the bullet-scarred van, the shackled detainees, and the exhausted ex-operators. Robert repeated their story in clipped detail. A massive cartel assault, federal detainees needing urgent high-security holding, national ramifications if they escaped. El Zurdo spat on the ground, ignoring the caked blood on his bandage. Vargas looked about, tense and furious, as if searching for an avenue of escape. The captain nodded curtly. "We'll place them in a secure brig. You'll have to wait for the feds or DHS to sort out the legalities." "That's all we ask," Robert said, relief flooding him. "We just need them out of Santa Rosa's reach." The gates opened, and the van rolled inside. Uniformed soldiers took custody of El Zurdo and Vargas, whisking them into a concrete holding facility deeper within the base. As Robert watched them go, he felt an enormous weight lift from his shoulders. The cartel's main objective, El Zurdo, was now behind military-grade defenses. Mojo let out a shaky chuckle. "We actually made it." Diego closed his eyes in gratitude, leaning against the van. "After everything, we're alive, and those two psychopaths are locked up." Before Robert could respond, his phone buzzed, Sam's number flashing. He answered, heart pounding. Sam's voice was faint with static. "Robert, the cartel's at the detention facility. They realized El Zurdo is gone. They're furious. We have hostages. Hurry." The line cut, leaving only dead air. A strangled chill gripped Robert's heart. He stared at the phone, Sam's last words echoing. "We have hostages. Hurry." The line had gone dead. The time they spent whisking El Zurdo to safety might have allowed the cartel to regroup and launch another strike. Mojo caught Robert's wide-eyed look. "What is it?" "They're back at the facility. They took hostages." Diego slammed a fist into the van's side. "We got the detainees out, but we left the staff vulnerable." Robert clenched his teeth. "We had no choice, but we're not done. We go back." Mojo's eyes widened. "We just got through a gauntlet of killers. The facility is in ruins." Robert met Mojo's gaze with steely resolve. "Sam and the IC staff stayed behind so we could pull this off. We can't abandon them." Diego sighed, pressing a hand to his aching wounds. "Then we load up. Let's see if the army can help." They appealed to the base's commanding officer, but the man was cautious. The base had no direct orders to intervene, and his limited force was not authorized to cross into an active police operation. Frustration clawed at Robert. Bureaucracy again, while the staff he promised to protect was in mortal danger. "Fine," Robert snapped. "We go alone." He turned to Mojo and Diego. "We'll drive back, see if the local PD is still on site. At least we can coordinate." The captain frowned. "I can't officially sanction that, but I won't stop you. Good luck." Within minutes, they refueled the van, grabbed some medical supplies from the base's infirmary, and headed westward, exhaustion overshadowed by grim purpose. Reese and Conrad, still battered, volunteered to come. "They took our friends," Conrad said, voice trembling with anger. "We're in this." The drive back felt surreal. Dawn light painted the desert in fiery oranges and pinks, a stark contrast to the horror they expected at the detention facility. They made better time on the main roads, now that the immediate cartel threat had diminished. Half an hour later, the town of Rio Seco appeared. Police roadblocks sealed off the approach to the facility, and news vans clustered like vultures. Robert stopped at a checkpoint manned by state troopers. They recognized him immediately. His face had become known after the earlier assaults. One trooper stepped forward, dismayed. "They came back around an hour ago. We tried to hold them off, but they used tear gas and hostages. We had to pull back." "Who's inside?" Robert demanded, heart pounding. "At least a dozen staff and some local cops, pinned down or captured. The cartel sets the terms. They're demanding El Zurdo, or they start killing." Mojo's face paled. "They're doubling down on intimidation." Robert swallowed the acid tang in his mouth. "We have to get inside. Move this blockade." The trooper hesitated. "We're not letting anyone through. The cartel threatened to shoot any officer that attempts a breach." Diego's voice came out shaky. "We're not just any officer. We're the only ones who can fix this." The trooper, torn, glanced at Robert's battered uniform. "You realize what you're walking into? They're entrenched, have turrets set up. We can't help you without the National Guard, and that's hours away." Robert nodded grimly. "Then hours is too long. We'll do it ourselves." After a tense moment, the trooper waved them through. Godspeed. They drove on, forging past empty streets, deserted in fear. Finally, the detention facility came into view, barricades of vehicles, armed cartel foot soldiers patrolling the perimeter. The once lively yard was silent, save for the flutter of torn flags and the glint of muzzle barrels. Robert parked the van out of sight behind a burned-out warehouse. The small team disembarked. Robert, Mojo, Diego, Reese, and Conrad. They carried rifles, sidearms, a handful of flashbangs, and determination hardened by everything they'd endured. Using binoculars, Robert counted at least 15 cartel enforcers visible outside, armed with rifles and possibly heavier weapons. More would be inside. Any direct assault was suicidal. But they had an advantage. They knew the facility's layout better than the cartel, especially the hidden approach from the side corridor or even the sublevel tunnels, if those were still passable. Robert turned to the group. "We slip in through the sublevel entrance near the service dock. With luck, they haven't fully secured it. We find Sam, we find the hostages. We do a rescue op, Delta style." Mojo cracked a tired grin. "One more mission." Diego clapped him on the shoulder, eyes gleaming with fierce resolve. "Let's finish this." The team readied weapons and gear. Behind them, the Texan sun climbed higher, bathing the shattered detention facility in harsh daylight. Inside those walls, friends and innocents awaited rescue or execution. The final stand was about to begin. A scorching sun beat down on the silent yard as Robert's makeshift strike team crept along the facility's perimeter. The cartel had posted lookouts near the main entrances, but the men, tired from a night of combat, didn't expect a stealth incursion via the sublevel. 2 cartel guards smoked cigarettes near the service dock, occasionally glancing around, their rifles slung. Hiding behind a wrecked ICE transport bus, Robert signaled quietly, "Take them out simultaneously." Diego nodded, aiming at the guard on the left. Mojo steadied his rifle on the right. They fired in unison, 2 suppressed shots. Both guards crumpled without a cry. Reese and Conrad dragged the bodies behind the bus, clearing the path. The service dock door was pried open, revealing a hallway leading to the sublevel steps. Robert eased inside, weapon raised. The passage was dim, half-lit by emergency fixtures. They slipped downstairs, mindful of the site where bombs had nearly collapsed D-block. Twisted metal and debris from the earlier explosions cluttered the corridor. Robert found the original utility tunnel sign taped to the wall, sublevel access, the same route he and Mojo had used hours before. Mojo motioned for silence. They advanced, hearing faint echoes, distant footsteps, voices barking in Spanish. Hard to tell how many. Robert prayed the cartel hadn't remined the area with explosives. The memory of disarming that ticking bomb made his pulse quicken. At the end of the corridor, they spotted a flicker of flashlight beams. 2 cartel men hovered by a junction, apparently guarding a path that led up to the main wings. They looked bored, weapons lowered. Robert gestured. Flashbang. Reese withdrew a small device, pulled the pin, and lobbed it around the corner. A thunderous pop, white light flooding the narrow space. The guards shouted, staggering blindly. Robert's team lunged in, guns barking. Both guards fell, stunned and bloodied. Diego quickly checked them, shaking his head. Neither was in shape to fight back. The team pressed on, climbing a set of stairs that emerged near the detention facility's central corridor. The overhead lights were out, replaced by flickering emergency bulbs. A hush lay over the place, broken by the occasional bark of a cartel enforcer or the terrified whimper of a hostage. The air tasted stale, as if the AC systems were down. Robert paused, pressing his ear to a closed door. Muffled voices. He cracked it open a sliver, glimpsing the main administrative hallway. Four cartel enforcers stood there, guns trained on a row of kneeling hostages, ice staff maybe half a dozen, hands on their heads. Sam Tien was among them, face bruised, shirt stained with blood. His eyes were defiant but fearful. One of the cartel men sneered, shouting in Spanish to Sam, "Where is El Zurdo? Where did you take him?" Sam mumbled something, face twisted in pain. A guard slammed him with a rifle butt. Another hostage sobbed, and the gunman growled, "Shut up!" Robert's blood boiled at the sight. He whispered urgently to his team, "We can't risk them killing hostages if we open fire randomly." He scanned the corridor, noticing a half-blocked side room. "We circle around, create a diversion. Then we strike from both ends." Mojo and Diego nodded. "We'll circle. You hold the door," Diego said, checking the map in his head. If they used an adjacent office corridor, they could flank behind the cartel men. Reese and Conrad stayed with Robert. Carefully, Diego and Mojo vanished around a corner. Tension built, each second feeling like an hour. Robert kept his gaze on Sam and the other staff. The cartel grew impatient, shouting about the time limit. One threatened to start executing hostages if they didn't get answers. "Hurry," Robert silently prayed. He flexed his grip on his rifle, heart pounding. Then, from the hallway's opposite side, a loud crash reverberated Mojo and Diego's diversion. One of the cartel men swore, pointing his weapon away from the hostages to investigate. Robert seized the moment. "Now!" he yelled, bursting through the door. His rifle barked, dropping the nearest gunman. Reese and Conrad followed, blasting the second. The remaining two spun, confused, only to be hammered by fire from behind as Diego and Mojo opened up. In seconds, all four cartel men lay sprawled on the floor, weapons skittering. The hostages shielded their heads, trembling. Sam blinked in astonishment, then relief flickered across his battered features. Robert rushed forward, kneeling beside Sam. "You okay?" Sam tried to laugh but coughed instead. "I felt better, but thanks. They took some others to D-Block. More hostages, maybe 6 or 7, including cops. We have to help them." Robert gently helped Sam stand. The other freed staff were shaky but alive. One guard nursed a broken wrist, another a gash on his scalp. They whispered thanks, eyes wet with emotion. Mojo retrieved a battered radio from one dead cartel enforcer. He listened briefly, then cursed. "They're calling for backup. More men in D-Block, and I heard them say something about killing the hostages if they don't get an update soon." Sam steadied himself against a wall. "We'll come with you." Robert shook his head. "No. Get these people out. The facility isn't safe. The cops outside can treat the wounded. We'll handle D-Block." Sam hesitated but nodded. "Be careful, my friend." Sam led the rescued staff away, leaving Robert's team to push deeper into the facility's labyrinth. Down in D-Block, more armed cartel fighters awaited, hostages at their mercy. The final rescue loomed, a last leap into the lion's den. Blood smeared the walls of D-Block from the earlier battle and infiltration attempts. Twisted remnants of metal doors and scattered rubble testified to the carnage wrought the previous night. Now, in the stark glow of emergency lights, the labyrinth of corridors felt more like a tomb. Robert, Mojo, Diego, Reese, and Conrad advanced cautiously, weapons at the ready. Each step echoed in the emptiness. A muffled whimper ahead made them freeze. Robert held up a hand for silence, then gestured for Diego to peek around the next corner. Diego moved cat-like, leaning just enough to see. He signaled back. 2 cartel guards in the corridor, a half-dozen hostages kneeling. Another 2 cartel men further back, near the heavy blast door. The detainee cells around them stood open, bars twisted from earlier breaching charges. Robert exhaled through his nose. For hostiles, at least. Hostages right in the middle. Mojo grimaced. We'll need a double flank again, or a well-placed flashbang. Diego patted his vest. I used my last one in the sub-level. Robert checked his belt. I have 1 flash left. That's it. He thought for a second. We toss it behind them, away from the hostages, then move fast. Reese and Conrad steadied themselves, adrenaline surging. Hostage rescues were the most dangerous close-quarters scenarios, especially with the enemy on high alert. Robert clicked his comm to silent mode, then whispered, "Positions." Everyone took up stances around the corner. Robert readied the flashbang, heart pounding. He mouthed 3, 2, 1, and flicked the canister into the corridor. A sudden whump, a searing flash. The cartel enforcers yelled in shock, disoriented. Robert and his team stormed in, muzzles blazing. The first guard took 2 rounds to the chest, toppling backward. Another whirled, blind, firing a wild burst that chewed into the ceiling. Reese shot him in the leg, dropping him. Diego hammered a third with a close-range double tap, neutralizing him instantly. But the fourth, further down the hall, regained composure quicker than expected. He sprayed bullets at Conrad and Reese, forcing them behind cover. Robert advanced, returning fire, but the man ducked behind a half-collapsed door. Hostages lay prone on the floor, hands over their heads, screaming in terror. Mojo skirted the perimeter, stepping over a fallen cartel body. He caught the last gunman's flank. Before the man could react, Mojo put a round through his shoulder. The gunman collapsed with a groan, rifle clattering. Panting, Robert and Diego swept the area. No more tangos. Conrad and Reese checked on the kneeling hostages. 4 men, 2 women, mostly guards or clerks. They were terrified but alive. One sobbed with relief upon seeing them. Diego stood guard over the wounded cartel fighters, ensuring they didn't try anything. Robert crouched beside the hostages, quickly assessing injuries. Anyone critical? A female guard, shaking, pointed at a man who had a bullet graze. She sobbed. They said they'd kill us if we didn't say where El Zurdo was. But we didn't know. Robert squeezed her shoulder gently. It's over now. You're safe. He keyed his comm. Sam, we have the D-block hostages. Corridor secure. Sam's voice crackled with raw emotion. Thank God. We're outside near the main gate, clearing out the last pockets. Some cartel are surrendering. Robert felt a wave of near disbelief. After so many assaults, infiltration attempts, and a threatened helicopter strike, the tide had finally turned. The biggest threats were gone. El Zurdo was in army custody, the helicopter was shot down, the sub-level bombs were defused, and the cartel had expended their best fighters. He helped the hostages to their feet. Injuries were treated with improvised bandages. Outside, the dawn brightened into morning, the day's heat pressing on the battered facility. Sirens wailed in the distance, a sign that more law enforcement and possibly National Guard units were converging at last. Robert glanced at the battered remains of D-block, scorched walls, shattered cell doors. He recalled the horrifying moments of the midnight assault, the frantic dash to keep El Zurdo from escaping. Now, the very space felt symbolic. They had fought the darkest corners of violence and emerged still standing, albeit scarred. Let's get out of here, Diego said softly. We've done our part. As they escorted the hostages back toward the main yard, Robert's phone buzzed again. This time, a text from an unknown number. It read, "We will never stop. Santa Rosa never forgets." A final reminder that even with victory in hand, the shadows of cartel vengeance would forever loom. Epilogue. A hard-won dawn. By midday, The Rio Grande Detention Facility swarmed with law enforcement, ambulances, and National Guard trucks. The once blood-stained courtyard was now a hub of triage and cleanup. Local reporters, kept at bay behind barricades, filmed the wreckage from a safe distance. Robert Chandler stood with his old teammates, Mojo, Diego, Red, Sam, Eagle Eye, and Breaker, along the perimeter fence that had been hastily repaired once again. Each man bore cuts, bruises, or bandages. The horrors of the night were etched in their eyes. Yet relief also shone there, a deep bond forged in the fires of combat. El Zurdo and Eduardo Vargas were gone to a military installation, awaiting federal indictment. The Santa Rosa cartel had been dealt a grievous blow, losing dozens of fighters, valuable equipment, and their credibility. But they were not finished. Robert read the ominous text again, feeling the old wariness coil in his gut. Sam Tien, leaning on a crutch for a twisted ankle, joined them. The DHS bigwigs are en route. They want statements, a full report. Breaker snorted. They'll probably try to keep everything classified. Who wants the public knowing a handful of ex-Delta Force guys fought off a cartel invasion at an ICE facility? Mojo rubbed a stiff shoulder. After this, I'm done with quiet security gigs. This turned out to be more explosive than half our missions overseas. Diego nodded. I'll be seeing these scenes in my nightmares. But we did good, saved a lot of lives. Red Jacobs gazed over the yard, where a line of wounded cartel survivors waited under armed guard for transport. We lost people, though. Good men. Civilians. This wasn't a clean victory. Robert felt that weight too. He recalled each fallen guard or trooper who'd never see another sunrise. We did what we had to, he said quietly. This was a war zone, whether the politicians call it that or not. Levi Eagle Eye Thorson shaded his eyes from the sun. What happens now, boss? Robert stared at the swirling dust in the distance as the Texas wind picked up again. We hand over the facility to the authorities. Let them rebuild, restaff, secure. We file our reports, maybe stick around for the inquiries. Then we move on. Mojo chuckled, though there was little humor in it. You sound as if you've got a plan. Robert shrugged, an old tiredness creeping into his voice. Not exactly, but the cartel has our names. We might never truly retire now. We'll have to watch our backs. All of us. A deep silence settled. They had triumphed here, but new battles might loom on the horizon. For a moment, the men who once served in Delta Force remembered that war never truly ends. It only shifts battlefields. Sam cleared his throat, lifting a battered radio. They want us for final debrief in the admin block. Robert turned away from the dusty fence, scanning the yard one last time. In the bright morning light, the facility didn't look quite so haunted. The fires were out, the killers neutralized, the innocent rescued. No matter what came next, they had won this day together. He led the team toward the battered main building. The echoes of gunfire had faded. The nightmares would remain, but dawn had broken over Rio Seco, and the Santa Rosa cartel's infiltration had been repelled by 6 of the deadliest men America had ever trained.